Chapter 1971. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:05 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1971. Kiza, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1971. Kiza, Huan, Daoist, Hewlett and Druid all looked forward with shock. Listening to the report of their subordinate, they didn't know how to react immediately. They had upgraded their main territory to the silver grade not long ago, and they were preparing to continue their momentum swiftly as they approached the appropriate time to unleash their trump card and deal with Lionel. But they didn't expect that Lionel would react before they could. To the side, Kiza, the heir of the Gamine family, a young woman that Lionel had met and clashed with during the true selection of the Void Palace. Back then, Kiza had taken interest in Lionel because her mother had been one of the many to fall for his father, Velasco. She was very curious to learn about that man through Lionel, mostly because her mother was a woman she couldn't see falling for anyone. Of course, that included her father, who she had little to no respect for. It could be said that Kiza took after her mother in her disregard for most men. Unfortunately, she didn't get the chance to probe Lionel as much as she had wanted, as the true selection had been too hectic back then, not to mention the cataclysm that occurred not long afterward. However, hearing about his movements now, her interest had suddenly returned. In truth, she didn't think of Lionel much, and decades had passed since then. She was surprised, though, when the Libra family chose to change up their original plans by moving their cooperation up. When she learned that it was because of Lionel and the fact he had already taken out Nazag, she became even more intrigued. Her eyes couldn't help but narrow, a playful smile spreading across her vibrant pink lips. What do we do? How did he gather millions of subordinates already? Huan spoke with furrowed brows. It's not millions of subordinates. Kiza suddenly spoke. Their heads turned toward her all at once. Although she had a playful smile on her face, they didn't take it as a joke. Kiza looked like an airhead, but in terms of intelligence, she was ranked amongst the best of the human domain. There was a long time, before Lionel had done it, that many believed that if anyone were to surpass the scorned Queen Beauty on the Void Library's leader list, it would be her. But for whatever reason, Kiza had never bothered to enter the Void Library. Their soul constructs. You people really have no idea how the soul works. TSK. Hewlett and Druid, the two female Libra family members, were very much annoyed by Kiza's antics. But Huan and Daoist, who had practically grown up with her, were already wrapped around her little finger. Despite their genius, they practically just did as she pleased, which was also why it was so surprising to Kiza when they contacted her to change their original plans. Much like Wise Star Order had told Lionel all those years ago, the Gamine family was the only family of the human domain with any true understanding of the soul, and that was because their lineage factor allowed them far more free range than most humans. As such, when Kiza had sensed the unique fluctuations in some of the battles Lionel had fought, she had already sensed the uniqueness. Now hearing that he had suddenly manifested millions of subordinates, she put two and two together. Soul constructs. Where would he get so many soul constructs? By killing, of course. The group of four frowned, they didn't understand. Kiza shrugged. I'm very curious about certain things. The person who fascinates me more is Alienor Morales. I really wanted to know what about her was so much better than my mother, so I investigated her. She has a very uncanny ability to use soul constructs, and this was obviously passed down to her little boy. Although Kiza was smiling, Huan and Daoist looked away from her gaze, feeling a cold shiver down their backs. The two had had a crush on Kiza for the longest time, but they had never bothered to pursue her. That was because this woman had no heart. If that cold lump of coal in her chest opened up for anyone, it was her mother and her mother alone. Often, that love crossed a line that mother and daughter shouldn't have, and it also turned into a level of fanaticism that led to results like this. Although Kiza was speaking casually, the amount of killing intent she was exuding was palpable. There was no doubt she wanted to kill Alienor. Even so, that doesn't explain where he would get so many soul constructs. Also, if he could get millions of kill exchanges, why wouldn't he exchange them for real people? Druid and Hewlett, who didn't understand Kiza as well, asked with questioning tones. Their two cousins shuddered but didn't say anything. Can't you Libras use your heads? There are two of you and you practically share all thoughts. Shouldn't that make you smarter? First of all, using soul constructs wouldn't necessarily stop you from using kill exchanges. They're mutually exclusive. Secondly, where would he get millions of subordinates from? He entered the air war games later than anyone. Earth is still too weak to produce so many seventh-dimensional experts, while the Morales wouldn't provide him with such support for the sake of fairness. If I'm correct, he's probably already converted all of his kills into points by now. As for where he would get millions of kill exchanges, that's even more obvious. What is the easiest way to gain kill exchanges? Their eyes suddenly widened and they stood to their feet. Gold grade? Already? How is that possible? The hearts of the Libra family shook. To clear the gold grade, one had to have the equivalent of millions of subordinates. Even if they were soul constructs, didn't gaining those soul constructs mean that Lionel had such means already? Why was Kiza so casual about this? How do we deal with this? Kiza leaned back and reclined. What do you mean, how do we deal with this? We don't. We are on opposite sides of the supercontinent. His soul constructs won't last the trip all the way over here. Don't you think it's about time the Nova brothers clashed? Let them wear each other down. Kiza took a sip of a drink and closed her eyes. Juan and Droit looked toward one another. They knew Kiza better than anyone. If there was anyone who took Lionel's words the most personally, it was her. She seemed carefree, but she was the most arrogant person they knew. Lionel claiming that he would kill as many as he saw was probably the one thing that actually made her take these air wars seriously. And when Kiza was serious, she didn't have just one plan, she had at least three. As for what those other two were, until the moment they were revealed, maybe no one but her would know. There was maybe nothing more dangerous than a scorned woman. Though, if one said such a thing to Kiza, she would probably kill them without the slightest hesitation. If the person she hated most was Alienor, the person she hated the second most was none other than the Queen's scorned beauty. Chapter 1972. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1972. Agreement: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1972 Agreement. A tide of violence swept through the Dayside supercontinent. Nothing could seem to stop it. Lionel and Little Blackstar took the vanguard, causing death and destruction. Every time they took action, the opposing armies were thrown into chaos and disorder. After they were finished, the strongest of Lionel's subordinates would rush over, splitting up the most powerful combatants and stopping them from having the opportunity to support the more average fights. Then, the army of millions would swoop in. The army of soul constructs was relentless. They maintained the same savage air that they had during the upgrade challenge, their bloodthirst often overwhelming the enemies before them. Even when one managed to hold their ground and fight back, witnessing one rise back from the dead as though they had never been harmed in the first place was enough to shatter even the strongest morale. By the time half of Lionel's 13 or so hours were through, his territory had already expanded by as much as 30% and the hold he had over the Dayside supercontinent had begun to approach as much as 60%. He suffocated and suppressed the other territories, and his blade never seemed to show mercy. Given the circumstances, his kill rate had dropped from 100% of heirs. It couldn't be helped, some didn't have the fortitude to stay until the final moments, or the stupidity, depending on how you looked at it. One after another, heirs abandoned their chances at glory and vanished. When they appeared on the glass cube once again, they gasped for breath, their expressions pale and their gazes flickering with fear. In those moments, they had truly felt the scent of death. Seeing the states, flashes of pity couldn't help but spark in the eyes of their elders. True death was one thing, but this sort of death of the heart was another kind altogether. The image of Lionel, standing loftily atop the back of a roaring black dragon was simply far too much for them to handle. Maybe in their lifetimes, they would never be able to raise their heads and face Lionel as equals. In this lifetime, they could only submit. Noah fought valiantly on the battlefield. His saber was bold and his courage was commendable, however he could only feel that the gap between him and Lionel only seemed to be widening. Much like the elders of the human domain, He too had sensed the fork in the road that Lionel had just faced, and quite frankly, if it had been up to him, he wasn't sure if he would have chosen to take this route. Things seemed to be going smoothly now, but Lionel's current actions, his boldness, his trumpeting victories, was only provoking others. It seemed like a simple choice to use an army of millions to face off against groups that were only a few 10,000 at most, but that was only surface-level analysis from those with little understanding of military affairs and war. Noah had spent much of his life on the battlefield, and he knew Lionel wasn't a fool. One of the worst things a military commander could do was to overextend themselves, and there were very strong arguments for the fact that this was what Lionel was doing right this moment. Even so, he stood in the skies with a cold expression. Every time they conquered a territory, he would snatch its city core and leave it ruins. Then, as though it was an adequate replacement, he would leave behind an outpost and move on without a word. He continued to grind away at his enemies, making bold move after bold move. Noah could see that some fatigue was already accumulating along Lionel's brow, but the latter didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a simple task to just reform the destroyed soul constructs. Every time he did so, another bit of his stamina would be sapped away. Although his stars could quickly replenish it, he was wasting more than he was recovering. Even so, the fact that Lionel could sustain millions of soul constructs at all was a great shock. A slight fatigue after what should have been doing something impossible for most was far too difficult to fathom, and yet it was happening right before them all. Seeing Lionel crush the dreams of one heir after another, though, the conflict within Noah's heart only continued to grow. He truly couldn't understand the difference. Were some people simply born better? He knew about Lionel's life. He knew that Lionel was a normal teen of the entertainment stream for most of his life. Other than being a 5-star professional, there was nothing special about him. Whereas he had been a prince of the empire from the day he was born. He had the best teachers, the best resources, the best training. So why was he so inferior? The harsh reality was that Noah knew that Lionel agreed with him as well, not just Lionel, but even his own grandfather. Lionel had always thought he was better than others. The difference was that he felt this betterness was superficial and not enough to calculate the worth of a person. As such, he was determined to use the fact he was simply born better than others to help those around him and create a world where such heartache wasn't necessary. This was why he had always taken these burdens on his shoulders, why he had wanted to be a king and not an emperor. Although his ruthlessness had increased in recent times and his views had shifted somewhat, this was still the very foundation of his being. Emperor Fox, however, was a bit more difficult to read. Even so, his actions seemed to state that he didn't care much about the world at all. He got rid of the useless, slaughtering them en masse. His true goals and aspirations were unknown, but it was safe to say that he wanted to maximize the growth of his empire, even if it meant sacrificing innocence. As for whether there was a deeper layer to that story, only he would know. The irony to Noah, though, was that these two men that he respected greatly, both of them agreed on a fundamental level. There were simply certain barriers one couldn't overcome without being born with a certain advantage others didn't have. The army came to a slow halt. In the distance, the flag of a silver-grade city with walls even taller than Lionel's gold-grade city appeared. 5th Nova's territory. Chapter 1973. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1973, only as good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1973, only as good. The armies of 5th Nova had long since prepared, but it wasn't the armies that had made Lionel pause. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the tall walls. He still had 2 wall collapsing exchanges that he hadn't used yet. He simply hadn't run into any enemies that were worth the effort. The Pisk and Quarius families had been the only ones that made the loss worthwhile. But now he realized even without trying that the remaining 2 that he had wouldn't work now. These walls weren't built by a mysterious system. They were almost certainly built by 5th Nova and his subordinates. They were several times more powerful than a gold-grade wall and were probably more powerful than even the air-grade walls would be. One shouldn't take the pre-generated walls lightly. Even the subgrade wall had taken a combined effort of Lionel and Aina resonating their attacks to take it down in one strike. The difference between each subsequent grade of wall was only more exaggerated. During Lionel's battle with Nazag, his territory had been too small to accommodate everyone, and as such they had gathered outside, plus their walls had only been at the subgrade and not very useful. When he fought with Armand, their village had only been at the bronze grade and they faced a similar problem with Nazag. Plus, Lionel had descended from the skies back then, making it difficult for even those walls to have much use. However, upon reaching the silver grade, dropping down from the skies was already an impossible workaround, as the walls came formulated with a built-in formation that protected both around and above. At the gold grade, this formation was obviously even stronger, and as such, Ramon's self-created walls were even more devastating on the defensive front. Lionel stopped the army because he knew no amount of forward momentum would be able to crush what was before him. He would only waste stamina going headlong without thinking. He couldn't help but silently nod to himself. Indeed, he wasn't the only person in the air wars with such grand methods. He didn't have a monopoly on force crafting or scheming. His fifth cousin was the most silent of the bunch, allowing Valerie to take the reins, but as a man born with both the metal synergy and spear domain lineage factor, he had his own strengths. At that moment, atop the tall silver walls, a young woman, wearing bronze armor and wielding a spear that looked a lot more like a glaive with a blade half the size of her body, appeared. Lionel recognized her at a glance as Valerie. From what Lionel understood, she was one of the last to be born in his father's generation. But in reality, she only counted as such because she was born to parents of his grandfather's generation. The truth was that she couldn't be considered to be a part of the Nebula or Nova generation. Lionel knew very little about her, but of what he did know he understood that she was very unsatisfied with the current Air Wars system. She had only been born with the spear domain lineage factor and as such, hadn't had the right to participate. It also didn't help that she was born sort of in between generations, making the logistics even more difficult on her. Members of the Morales family weren't technically allowed to participate in the air wars, so that it didn't seem that the family was supporting one over the other. In addition, this rule minimized infighting and maximized the cohesiveness of the group. Even if a few heirs butted heads, there would be no deaths, and because their family branches wouldn't be involved, the grudges would be at a minimum. However, Valerie had become Ramon's wife, and as a result she was granted a unique exception. Even amongst the Morales family, rumors couldn't help but spread. A strong woman like Valerie was obviously well known, and her fierce personality was even more so. Everyone had thought that she would end up with a man even more headstrong than she was, but to end up with the silent Ramon of all people, no one could have expected such a result, until they suddenly understood. If Valerie was going to fulfill her dream of becoming the heir apparent of the Morales family, who would be a better puppet than Ramon? He was silent, closed off, and even his own family knew very little about him. From the thoughts of others, Valerie strong-arming Ramon into marriage was an easy feat. Valerie, being Valerie, though, never cared to address those rumors. Anyone she caught talking about such things would just taste her blade, and that would be the end of it. Now, however, Valerie stood on top of the walls, her gaze narrowed and sharp. She had been expecting to see a Nova on the other side, but she hadn't expected it to be 7th Nova. If Valerie was honest, she quite liked Lionel. He had given the Morales family a great deal of face with his attitude. Although she was worried that he had spoken a bit too arrogantly and might end up falling hard because of that, the fact that he was here seemed to mean that he had backed up a lot of what he had to say. Even so, seeing that they were enemies now, it didn't dull her blade in the slightest. In fact, it made it stronger. Little Blackstar moved forward until his shadow loomed over the city. By this point, the moon was looming high in the skies, but with Blackstar's appearance, his head overshadowed it, casting a mighty darkness over the city. At this moment, many of 5th Nova's subordinates had been resting, but upon hearing the commotion, they immediately lined up. They had known that something was coming, but even so, they had slept like babies. With a single glance, Lionel could see just how well trained these warriors were, and the look of respect they gave toward Valerie was an even more striking sign. Archers lined the walls and prepared for battle. They all held real bows and powerful arrows. Lionel knew that even if he crushed their bow force, the power of the crafts backing them would be enough to do some real damage. A single one of those arrows could kill a gold-grade threat. If they sent volley after volley, within a few minutes he would be drained of dream force even if he revived them all. Lionel analyzed the situation quite quickly. There was no doubt that this would be his greatest challenge since stepping foot into the air wars. Even so, his gaze was calm. Little Blackstar lowered his head until Lionel was eye level with Valerie. He smiled slightly for the first time since entering this place. It was clear that he treated them far differently than he did the others he had come across. I guess I should call you Big Sis, right? Let's have a good battle. These walls though. I'm afraid they aren't enough. Valerie's gaze softened somewhat before they sharpened once again into a sneer. She raised her spear and pointed it at Lionel's head, but at the same time, Lionel had raised his arms, his left kidney beginning to shine with a burning glow. A formation is only as good as its weaknesses, Lionel said softly. Within the core of the city, Ramon's eyes suddenly snapped open. Chapter 1974. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1974. Weaknesses. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1974 Weaknesses. Lionel Irises danced with complex runes that fused and separated before fusing once more. A great feeling of danger suddenly took hold of Valerie and she felt like something she should stop was about to happen. But before she could, dozens of fireballs appeared in the skies, the temperature skyrocketing as they descended quicker than Valerie could react. Bang! 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 There didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to the descending balls of fire, but every collision caused a quake that rocked the city. By the time the third had descended, the invisible barrier had taken shape and become very real, cracks spreading across its transparent surface. By the time the sixth descended, the walls had begun to shake as well, their structural integrity seemingly in jeopardy. Then, suddenly, all of the remaining over dozen descended at once. The reaction was immediate. The invisible barrier cracked like glass, motes of light descending from above in a beautiful, yet tragic sort of way. The balls of fire only continued to rain downward, setting fire to the city and laying waste to much of what was in its path. Valerie's expression changed. She understood Ramon's skill quite well. By this point, he had already overshadowed many of the older generation in terms of his force crafting. There shouldn't have been anyone amongst the heirs that was his match in this regard, and that was only further proven by the gold-grade armors that fitted each and every one of their warriors. Ramon hadn't slept a single wink since the air wars began. Even though the fatigue had set in for him long ago, he only continued to press forward. Valerie had seen his hard work personally, and she knew how meticulous he was. There was simply no way he would have made any large mistakes that could be so easily explored. In that case, the only explanation was that Lionel was just far superior to him. The only thing stopping Lionel from forging true 8th-dimensional treasures currently was a lack of force strength and little Tolly's limitations. He had already stepped through the boundary of the life grade, and the gap between that and the gold grade could only be said to be enormous. There was simply no other explanation. What Ramon saw was a perfect construction, one that he had poured his blood and sweat into. In terms of gold grade constructions, it was probably among the best possible, period. However, what Lionel saw was a construct that wasn't whole. The definition of the life grade wasn't a level of strength. Rather, it represented a product that was so perfectly synergized that it seemed to have life, a product so perfect that it seemed as though the universe itself had created it. Ramon's construction, however, was far from that, and to Lionel, every point of imperfect synchronization was only another weakness. A weakness that could be exploited. Despite the change, Valerie reacted quickly. Fire at will. Her roar echoed across the skies. The archers raised their bows, but with a flicker of Lionel's radiant crown, their bow force winked out one after another. Before the archers could respond to the change, Lionel's brothers, Aina and the others charged. Little Black Star whipped his tail out just once and they were all sent flying with great speed toward the walls. The moment they landed, a catastrophe seemed to have descended and the archers were thrown into complete disarray. Lionel reached out a palm and leapt forward, a black rod billowing dense fog darker than even the night sky appearing in his hand as he swung down toward Valerie. Though Valerie was shocked, she pivoted once more. She slid a foot back, gliding into an attack stance before piercing out toward Lionel's chest. If her attack landed, there was no doubt Lionel wouldn't even get the chance to step onto the walls. Lionel's gaze narrowed. What a perfect spear strike. Valerie's skill had returned to simplicity. Unfortunately. What good was a spear against Lionel? Just as Lionel had this thought, though, Valerie's spear strike smoothly turned into a javelin's throw, a strong bronze force coating it as she threw it. She had known long ago that Lionel had the spear domain ring and had lured him forward as such on purpose, lulling him with a false sense of security. Lionel's expression flickered. She hadn't used any spear force, and even if her spear crumbled, the force surrounding it definitely wouldn't. It was already too late to change his spear trajectory, but with a thought, 2 more stars appeared to Lionel's back. 10 stars shone with radiant splendor, 3 silver, 3 sky blue, 2 red gold, and 2 dark ocean blue. His aura changed and reached its peak, the presence of the heavenly body realm finally shining forth in full effect. Ever since he had shifted his perspective on universal force, this was the very first time Lionel had unleashed it fully. Before, the aura of universal force was far too subtle as it could only be displayed when he brought forth all of his stars. But now, there was no denying it. The human domain was shocked once more. They had never seen a heavenly body realm like this, a heavenly body realm that was so perfect, so powerful. Void Star Force descended and formed a force art before Lionel that quickly solidified into a shield. The moment the force art was completed, more runes formed within his 2 Void Star Force stars, strengthening them once more, but he didn't seem to notice at all as his spear continued to descend toward Valerie. Valerie's pupils constricted. She was still in a throwing motion, she wasn't in any condition to counterattack, she could only raise her forearm. But right then, an action that looked like a desperate attempt, shifted. The slots in her armor's forearm opened up and formed a round shield, meeting Lionel's spear tip head-on. Bang! Valerie was sent flying, her body streaking through the air like a shooting star. Chapter 1975. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1975, right now. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1975 right now. Valerie crashed into the building below as Lionel landed on the city walls. But just as soon as she did, she leapt to her feet, her battle intent blazing. With a flick of her wrist, the warped and broken shield was flung to the side and she brandished her fists. She didn't have the metal synergy lineage factor, so she obviously didn't have her own divine armor. The armor that Ramon had forged for her was already extremely excellent, and yet it couldn't survive a single strike against Lionel's spear. It was clear that that spear was above the gold grade. Even though Valerie found herself unable to use spear force and wearing armor that was practically useless to her, she still brandished her fists. Lionel looked down for a moment. Despite the carnage around him, his mind seemed to be silent. The archers had recovered after their first fall. Although they realized they couldn't use their bow force for whatever reason, they immediately switched their tactics. At the same time, the non-archers below and near the city quickly gathered, prepared to battle just as James reached the door mechanisms and forced the gates open for the tide of 3 million soul constructs to rush in. Lionel met Valerie's gaze and hesitated. He almost put his spear away, but after seeing the look in her eye, he tightened his grip instead. "All right," he said lightly. "In that case." Lionel's stars suddenly pulsed and they grew a size. Each had been barely a meter across each, but they suddenly expanded to 2, then 3, then suddenly reached 10. The flood of universal force increased like a rising tide. The skies rumbled and the earth quaked. The skies above had been quite dark, but motes of lights began to quickly accumulate, each matching one of the colors of Lionel's heavenly body realm stars. Lionel raised a foot, and by the time it descended, his body had flickered and vanished. He was a blinding streak in the skies, activating star fusion, king's might, and descending with a mighty momentum. One spear to connect the earth and skies. The black rod in Lionel's hands suddenly became a pillar of dark gold. At that moment, Ramon rushed out from the core of the city. The bags under his eyes had grown to the point they were blackened. Even so, his eyes shone like stars, a far cry from the timid gaze he had seemed to have the first time Lionel met him. When he saw Lionel strike about to land, his expression changed and he rushed forward, but it was already too late. Valerie struck out with her fist. A surprising amount of fist force coated it as he roared, some of the hints of simplicity that had coated her spear transitioning toward her fist. Lionel seemed struck by it at first. How long had it been since he used fist force? Longer than he could remember. Why was this fist so beautiful, though? Despite its beauty, it didn't seem to matter. When Lionel's spear descended, Valerie's fist only paused it for a moment before her arms split apart like pressurized wood. Her eyes rolled back from the pain, her forearm combusting into a rain of blood and gore. She was sent flying back once more, sliding along the ground and leaving a bloody trail as she fell to Ramon's feet. Ramon's eyes widened as he hurried forward. Valerie? Valerie. Ramon slid along his knees to her side, his brown eyes colored with anguish. He didn't seem to know what to do. He wanted to help her, but he also didn't dare to touch her for fear of making it all worse. His hands approached and retreated again and again, a flustered expression taking over him. He looked up to find the crumbling pieces of his formation still falling. Despair colored his gaze. No, it wasn't despair, it was guilt, a heavy guilt that sunk like cold in the winter or darkness in the deepest pits. Lionel recognized that gaze. It was the same gaze he had had when he watched his subordinates die one after another in the Valiant Heart Zone, subordinates that he would no longer see again now due to his own selfishness. Given Ramon's reaction alone, one could tell that the rumors about the two were nothing more than nonsense. Ramon finally reached forward and held Valerie up, if for nothing other than not wanting her to rest her head on the hard ground any longer. Valerie coughed, blood flying from her lips. Her eyes regained some focus and she looked up. Her eyes softened somewhat when she saw Ramon's tears, but then she began to push him away, coughing and wheezing all the while. You big dope, I'm not going to die, it's just an arm, what are you doing? You're embarrassing me. How can my husband be such a crybaby? Ramon clenched his teeth, but his tears didn't stop falling. It was his fault, it was all his fault. He didn't make a formation that was strong enough. If only he had been better, if only he had held up his end of the bargain, this would have never happened. Ramon looked toward Lionel, a fierce glare in his eyes. But at that moment, Valerie reached for his collar with her only good remaining hand and stopped him. Forget it, he has the spear domain ring and there are probably others eyeing us right now. There's no use in fighting amongst ourselves, a Morales has to win this, for maybe the first time in their relationship, though. Ramon didn't listen to Valerie. He grabbed her wrist and pulled, forcing her to loosen her grip as he stood with a dark expression hanging between his brows. He walked toward Lionel with heavy steps, bronze runes forming all along his body as his halo took form and his divine armor began to appear piece by piece. Valerie watched his back with a complicated expression, weakness overtaking her. Ramon had been quite like Armand, not caring much about these air wars and never wanting to participate in the first place. It was only because of Valerie and the face of the Morales family that he had done so. But right now, he wasn't a Morales, nor was he an heir, or a genius fighting for glory. Right now, he was nothing more than an enraged husband. Chapter 1976. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1976. Third, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1976. Third, Lionel and Ramon's gazes met, the latter filled with rage and the former as cool as an iceberg. Internally, though, Lionel sighed. He couldn't say that he hadn't expected something like this to happen, but this also made the situation 100 times more complicated to handle. He hadn't wanted to harm Valerie so much, but there were 2 reasons he had no choice but to. The first was time. He didn't have the time to be soft-hearted and battle it out with his fists. The second reason was because not going all out would only be an insult to her. While to outsiders it seemed that he was relying on the spear domain ring, he himself knew quite well that even if he took the ring off right this moment, it wouldn't change anything. His sovereignty had transcended the need for the spear domain ring. Now, however, he was faced with another choice once again. Would he go easy on Ramon? Suddenly, Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Ramon's fist had appeared right before his face and he hadn't sensed it until it was too late. Bang! Lionel's head snapped to the side and he took a heavy step back. His divine armor quaked once and dispersed the damage, but his pupils were still constricted. What was that just now? Ramon's fist appeared before Lionel again, but Lionel took a light step on the ground, retreating and expanding the distance between them, but somehow, Ramon's fist remained before him. Lionel raised his spear to block, but Ramon's fist flickered past it, landing heavily on his chest. Bang! 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 Lionel's feet slammed into the ground 3 times in succession, each one driving him back further and cracking the earth beneath him. The amount of force that his armor was dispersing even caused the ground to seem to implode, as though a pressurized geyser was erupting from within. My senses are being distorted. No, they aren't being distorted, it's as though he's using blind spots to take advantage of me. But how could my internal sight have blind spots? More importantly, how could my vision have blind spots? Lionel's gaze flickered, his eyes landing on Ramon's armor. He realized after just a split moment of deduction that it was Ramon's armor. It was definitely his divine armor doing it. If Lionel was correct, the core piece of his armor should be a Dream Force domain type ore, but he couldn't sense the exact ore, which meant that just like he had with his self-created formation, Ramon had self-created an alloy for his divine armor. Lionel had done this before, so he knew exactly how difficult it was to fuse unruly 7th-dimensional ores into a single holistic piece. To do so with Dream Force type ores was even more obscene. It was less accurate to say that Ramon was wearing a gold grade armor, and far more accurate to say that he had taken a half step into the life grade as well. There was no doubt that if it wasn't for Lionel, Ramon would be the strongest crafter of the Nova generation. There's only one way. Lionel deduced. Lionel crossed his spear over his body again, but it was fruitless. Ramon's strikes were becoming harder to handle, and more powerful. Lionel could sense that Ramon's fatigue was slowly fading as he pumped more and more dream force into his body. As his fatigue faded, his strikes became more precise and more powerful. The jarring feeling of his organs being displaced shook Lionel awake. Ramon's power was getting to the point where even his divine armor was being overloaded. If there was anyone who was surprised, though, it was Ramon. Lionel had taken several direct shots and was clearly trying his best to block and failing. He had aimed for several vital points that should have left him entirely incapacitated. How could a divine armor forged by a 6th-dimensional expert had such great defense? Suddenly, Ramon's eyes widened. First he was focused on Valerie, then he had lost himself in rage when he faced Lionel, so this was the first time he noticed that Lionel's divine armor was actually of the life grade. How was that possible? At that moment, Lionel's body expanded, rising to over 3 meters tall and gaining an additional 2 pairs of arms and a pair of heads. Activating his panda construct, Lionel unleashed his starry spirit domain. In that moment, his internal sight was swapped for his dream world and the world became countless times clearer. Ramon's invisible dream domain came into sight and Lionel could sense the distortions. This time when Ramon punched forward, Lionel punched out with a free hand himself, meeting knuckle to knuckle. Boom! They both took a single step back, their forearms trembling. Ramon's eyes narrowed beneath his visor. He didn't know what had changed, but he too could sense a shift in the atmosphere. He immediately deduced that Lionel had deployed a domain as well, likely a sensory one. Even so, Ramon was unmoved as he pushed forward again, his single fist suddenly becoming 2, then 3. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he brandished his spear, striking out once and yet meeting all three fists at the same time. But to his shock, all three spear blades missed and Ramon's fist appeared before him again. That was when Lionel realized that this couldn't just be a distortion of dream force. His affinity in dream force was too high and he couldn't be so easily tricked. There was an underlying spatial force that Ramon had only just unleashed. Lionel's divine armor cracked and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, his body trembling as his heels left a deep trench in the ground. By the time he looked up, Ramon was already before him once again, bearing down with a fierce momentum. Lionel could practically see two red irises behind the latter's visor. Lionel coughed again and took a break. He activated his Starry Star domain and then his Lotus domain, his battle intent soaring. His ideas of going easy on Ramon seemed like nothing more than a joke now. This was the Air Wars, this was an heir of the Morales family, weakness didn't run through them. The lines of dream force and spatial force became clear in Lionel's eyes. Pushing his Lotus domain to the limits, he stripped Ramon of his spatial force and made use of the time force that it produced to strengthen the unpredictability of his blade. But at that moment, a third force descended from Ramon's domain. Chapter 1977. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1977. A genius if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1977. A genius. Lionel was certain after a single look. It was breaking force, the very force designed to break rules and surpass expectations, the very force known for shedding limits and shattering them. At that moment, Lionel's Lotus domain overloaded and crumbled. It didn't seem capable of fathoming an opposing force to breaking force. The three layers of Ramon's forces came together and his fists suddenly blotted out the skies. They came from all directions and no direction at the same time. It overloaded Lionel's senses, almost as though he didn't have enough minds to finish the calculation, but that was absolutely impossible. No matter how powerful Ramon was, he couldn't possibly form millions of variables and Lionel had at least that many minds. There was only one explanation. The breaking force was impeding his calculation ability. Lionel was almost never impressed. His standards were exceptionally high, and he thought even higher of himself. He didn't tend to be impressed by things he felt that he could do. But this divine armor of Ramon's. What a genius. Lionel felt another fist crash into his chest. Half of his panda construct was ripped to shreds and the remaining impact collided with him, dealing him the worst injury he had suffered since entering the Air Wars. Heavy breathing forced Lionel to swallow more blood than he would have liked. Half of his body hung out from his panda construct, his chest a mess of flesh. This Ramon sure was interesting. He was the most inconspicuous, but if not for Lionel, the odds of him winning these Air Wars were exceptionally high. Lionel felt the most pressure from Daoist, but after interacting with Ramon, he felt that it should actually probably be a 50-50 split between the two of them. He had really run into a buzzing chainsaw this time. Let alone Lionel, even Valerie was very much surprised. She didn't know much about Ramon's combat strength because he never fought. He was famously still a galaxy-ranked disciple despite being in the 7th dimension because he refused to battle to this extent. However, it could be said that this wasn't a display of combat strength, per se. This was a display of his magnum opus, the craft he had poured the most blood, sweat and tears into, his divine armor. Crush your badge and apologize to my wife later, and I will let you go. Ramon said coldly. Lionel couldn't help but laugh inwardly. The whole apology to his wife later was clearly Ramon's attempt to save some face for Lionel. He knew that human domain was watching and forcing Lionel to apologize for what was effectively him doing what he should be doing was too much. Despite his situation, Lionel found it a bit adorable. He definitely didn't have the capability of being so level-headed. If someone had shattered Ana's arm, even if she could practically instantly heal it, he would have probably lost his mind. Morales or not, the suffering of whoever had done it would be great. I will let you know that I haven't brought out my full strength. Even without my spear, I still have my other trump cards and my ability index. You've done well enough, don't force my hand. Lionel suddenly took a deep breath, causing raging winds to surge forward from all directions. The violent vortex ruffled both Lionel and Ramon's hair. Ramon's gaze narrowed as Lionel's injuries seemed to heal in practically the blink of an eye. In just a few seconds, his blood was trickling down from smooth and unblemished bronzed skin. A rushing aura surged out from Lionel, and the rest of his panda construct shattered as he fell from within it and landed on the ground. He shook his head, pointing his spear down toward the ground as the bronze aura around him suddenly began to tremble, becoming slowly brighter and brighter. Noted, Lionel said lightly. Batum. Lionel's heartbeat was like a roaring beast, echoing over the city and causing a wild earthquake. But I still have a few tricks up my sleeve as well. At that moment, Lionel's halo suddenly expanded and began to trail down the length of his body. Ramon and those watching couldn't help but frown. Lionel should have already taken out his divine armor before. How could a trump card be something you have already taken out already? But right then, what should have been something they had already seen before became something decidedly different. The design of the armor was entirely different. With every movement, its joints and valves expanded and contracted. It looked almost like a living, breathing creature. While it carried the same pearly white and jade green colors, it also had an added black accent to it that made it look decidedly more dark and powerful. As the first streams of vital star force slowly closed the distance toward it from Lionel's vital star, the world seemed to fall into silence. When the streams finally entered the armor. Rumble. A piercing light howled into the skies. Lionel opened his arms wide. The amount of vitality coursing through his body made him feel wide awake. It felt as though he could shatter the world with a single step. Lionel raised his foot and Ramon's pupils constricted instantly. The latter retreated, ready to expand the distance, but Lionel had somehow already appeared before him. Bang! Ramon didn't even realize when Lionel's fist had landed on his abdomen. He only vaguely noted that his divine armor had shattered to pieces. Lionel quickly retracted his fist, feeling that he would have pierced right through Ramon's stomach in that moment. However, his mercy is exactly what caused Ramon's body to shoot out like an iron ball from a cannon, streaking through the air with such speed that a harsh whistling sound filled the air. Lionel landed lightly on the ground, looking forward. He didn't seem surprised by the result at all, but the same couldn't be said for the remainder of the human domain. No one seemed to know how to respond. Lionel had taken out a second life-grade divine armor. Chapter 1978. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1978. Big difference if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1978. Big difference. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. The gap between the strengths of his divine armors were enormous. Vital Star Force was a high-level force, and maximizing its usage required materials that were equally as high-level. Just now, Lionel leapt from a pseudo-life grade of the 4th dimension to one of the 5th dimension. The gap didn't need to be described. Ramon's domain was only as solid as the defenses of his divine armor, and was only as useful as the weakness of his enemies. While Lionel didn't have a way to counter it, there was always the most obvious method remaining: absolute strength. Lionel felt a glare on him, and he looked toward it to find Valerie, who had already stumbled to Ramon's side. He could only sigh. What else was he supposed to do in this situation exactly? Luckily, Valerie seemed to understand and shook her head. Looking around, she knew they had lost. It would take several days, maybe even weeks, for Ramon's divine armor to repair itself, and it had clearly been his greatest trump card. They didn't have any more chances. With a sigh, Valerie found the badge in Ramon's chest pocket and crushed it. Very quickly, he, as well as all of his subordinates, vanished. The sounds of battle came to an end, but Lionel looked up toward the skies with a frown. Usually, he would keep his starry spirit domain activated at all times. His dream world gave far sharper clarity and was much less easily fooled than his internal sight, so it was a no-brainer so long as he had the stamina. However, when he entered the air wars, he had kept it in reserve. The first reason was because while he could hold it up with great ease in the outside world, there was a great suppression here that drained him quickly, especially when he used Dream Force. The second reason was because the range wasn't large enough to give him a huge advantage regardless. His internal sight was 10 kilometers, but his dream world only extended for 100 meters now. When he used his second-tier divine armor, though, this range expanded to just over a kilometer, though the range of his internal sight remained the same. Just now, he had caught a whiff of something his internal sight had missed. Those resonating strings. Libra family, huh? Lionel had learned quite a bit by reading what the Void Library had to offer. In return, he had a surface to mid-level understanding of every prominent lineage factor in the human domain and even some of other races from what wars and battles had gathered. When he saw the faint string of linked soul force, he recognized it immediately. He also wasn't surprised. Since he had known about their abilities, he also had guessed that they would use it like this. Lionel's lips suddenly curled and he flickered and vanished. His speed was ridiculous, leaving a trail of blue in his wake as his figure was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. He had appeared before the Libra family members before they even understood what was happening. He reached out, grabbing their head. They immediately tried to fight back, but if even Ramon couldn't withstand a single strike, how could they? They found their legs dangled in the air as their arms squirmed about, but no amount of punching or kicking seemed to do a thing. If Lionel's first armor had sturdy defenses, this one was practically an impenetrable wall. The Libra family member felt as though they were punching against the wall, and suddenly, they felt nothing. Lionel shattered their neck with a single squeeze. Why would he waste time interrogating a living person when he could take everything he needed from their soul with much greater ease? Resume the connection with your sibling, Lionel commanded. Yes. The Libra family member reacted almost too eagerly, but this was simply the power of the King's Might lineage factor. With a flicker, Lionel vanished and killed yet another Libra family just as they were grieving the loss of their brother. The change was abrupt and it seemed to happen without cause. Even now, those watching had yet to recover from the appearance of a second life-grade armor when the two had died in quick succession. The Libra family elders were standing close with the Gamine family members. They were worried about Lionel's display, but they felt that their people were in a good position. With their experience, the things that the heiress of the Gamine family had deduced, they had as well, so they knew that Lionel shouldn't last much longer. But this sudden change had caught them completely off guard. This wasn't the first time they had seen this ability of Lionel's, but the visceral disgust they felt towards seeing it in this light was like a punch to the gut. Watching a grieving sibling suddenly begin groveling at the feet of the man who would have otherwise felt great hatred for moments ago, they felt shivers down their spines. Ramon and Valerie had just appeared in the range of the Morales family members and were quickly taken in. When they saw that Lionel was actually slaughtering people, their expressions changed once more. While they knew Lionel had been merciful with them, seeing his ruthlessness painted a completely different picture. Lionel, though, didn't seem to care about this at all. He had already warned these people once. Their shivers, their disgust, if anything, was only able to make him sneer. Lionel stood before the two constructs for a moment before waving his hand and sending them away. His conversation with them seemed to be brief, but he also seemed to be satisfied with it. His figure vanished once more, and when he appeared again, he had already taken the core of Ramon's city and begun to move forward, his divine armor fading. It was interesting. One of the main reasons he chose to use his lower-level divine armors first outside of hiding his strength for the moment was due to the stamina drain he knew they would have. But to his surprise, it wasn't very taxing at all. That was when Lionel remembered there was a big change between now and when he had created his divine armors. His metal synergy lineage factor was currently 8th dimensional. Lionel's lip curled. Chapter 1979. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1979. Time: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1979. Time: there's not much time left. Lionel thought for a moment. There was only a few hours left before his soul constructs would vanish. The current progress was worthwhile. He had taken out 2 constellation families, arguably two that would have been the most threat to him during the late game. In addition, he had dealt with a hidden ace like Ramon as well before he could build up any more momentum. The strength of Ramon's army wasn't to be underestimated. Even after the battle had gone on for so long, only a few of them had suffered casualties, while the amount of dream force Lionel had wasted reconstructing the soul constructs was more than he wanted to think about. If Ramon had been able to build an army of millions or even tens of millions like Lionel estimated most of the heirs would be capable of during the waning days of the Air Wars, and he had outfitted them all with gold-grade armors and weapons, their momentum would have been truly devastating. Gold-grade treasures didn't seem like a big deal, but it had to be understood that only the richest of seventh-dimensional existences would have one or a few to supplement their battle prowess. Existences like Lionel who could pull out life-grade items were few and far between. At the moment, Lionel simply didn't have the resources to outfit everyone with gold-grade items. He could only spare such expenses for the best of his subordinates. And, unfortunately, the segmented cube couldn't create life-grade items in his stead either. Its current limit despite being in the 8th grade was the gold grade. As for why this was, Lionel was actually sure of the details. There was likely something special about the life grade that required a human touch or an extreme level of precision the segmented cube couldn't seem to match. This was all to say that Ramon would have been a true problem if he was given any more time. If it wasn't for James and the others, even Lionel's soul construct army would have been run over. However, that begged another question. Was Ramon the only heir here? Lionel felt that the odds of that were very small. There were 7 of them, and he highly doubted that ancestor Hito would only place 2 of them on a single supercontinent. Of course, there was the possibility that with random placement, things had just ended up that way, but Lionel still felt a hint of caution. He had a vague map of the supercontinent in his mind. After he had tried to claim the entire continent through expanding his territory, he had picked out several strongholds. From his numbers, there should only be 2 such strongholds left along with dozens of others much smaller territories. The issue was that the 2 strongholds should already be accounted for. One, as he had just found out, should be the Libra family. As for the other, it should be the Gamine family, as he had also just found out. With his scope of understanding, there shouldn't be a third force hiding on the supercontinent. There simply wasn't enough land for a third to appear, especially when the Gamine and Libra, as he had once again just found out, were in cahoots with one another. All the territory between them was practically a no-man's land. In fact, they had only separated their territories as such for the sake of keeping up appearances and not letting the cat out of the bag too soon. Lionel didn't seem to be spending much thinking power on the Libra and Gamine families at all. He was entirely focused on where the next Morales would appear from, and maybe that was because of the impact Ramon had had on him. There were only 2 explanations for the lack of Morales here. Either he was wrong and the other 5 Novas had truly appeared on the other continent, or from the very start there was someone bold enough to head directly into the ocean. As for whether there was a third possibility or not, Lionel didn't have enough information to make a claim. There's another failure up ahead, James' voice drifted to Lionel's ears. As James had said, not long later, the group came across a barren village that had failed in the midst of its bronze grade upgrade challenge. They had come across quite a few of these. It was possible to tell they had failed because the bronze grade walls had formed, but had collapsed. In addition, their city core was cracked. These cracked city cores had a bit of value. You could fuse 3 cracked city cores into one to form a complete territory. It was an almost useless, secondary rule as it was probably only useful to those who had failed 3 times in a row and wanted a 4th opportunity. But by that point, they would have already been out of the race, so there was no point. Another option would be to repair it, but it cost double the upgrade challenge you had failed. There were no corpses to find in failed territories like this one since the heir in charge of it had probably already crushed their badge when they saw that the situation was bad. What needed to be questioned though was why such weak people would enter the air wars to begin with. If Lionel was correct, they were probably from fringe 7th-dimensional families. They probably even had 6th-dimensional individuals in the midst as well. What needed to be questioned though was why such weak people would enter the air wars to begin with. If Lionel was correct, they were probably from fringe 7th-dimensional families. They probably even had six-dimensional individuals in the midst as well. Lionel might have made it look easy, but even geniuses at Tier 9 of the 6th dimension weren't supposed to be able to fight against even the weakest 7th-dimensional existence. These people had truly overestimated themselves by participating at all. Lionel casually swiped the cracked territory core before moving onward. We won't be able to make it to the Libra and Gamine families. There's not enough time. This has been fruitful enough, it's time to turn back, Lionel suddenly said. The others nodded. They were beginning to feel a bit of fatigue as well. It had already been a near half-day since they set out and they had been battling and marching since. The suppression of these air wars was truly unforgiving. The army of soul constructs and Lionel along with his brothers and subordinates prepared to turn back. However, at that moment, the ground began to rumble. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he looked into the distance. More chapters coming. Chapter 1980. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1980. Retreat if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1980. Retreat, Lionel said calmly. He took a glance at the distance just a single time before turning away. With a leap, he landed on Little Blackstar's back, his expression calm. In the distance, an army led by Huan, Droit, Hewlett, Druid, and most obviously, Kiza, had appeared. They rode on the backs of beasts that were all quite shocking and powerful, so much so that although he had long since looked away, Lionel's eyes couldn't help but narrow. Lionel didn't recognize those beasts, but the people of the human domain most definitely did. Those were the very beasts that the Leo family had prepared beforehand, beasts that had given them a great advantage previously, but had suddenly now come under the control of the Gamine and Libra families. The Leo family's only choice was to be quite devastated about this. They were among the rare few that had two members of the Cataclysm generation with both Conan and Gunter, but neither of them were strategists and they were both quite simple-minded. In order to defeat them and claim their beasts, Kiza and the Libra twins only needed to defeat Conan. So long as Conan's badge was shattered, his beasts would be left behind. This was the difference between using a kill exchange for a beast and using points. If these beasts had been exchanged with kill exchanges, then they would have disappeared along with Conan and Gunter when they exited the air wars following their loss. The Leo family had used a loophole to gather a large amount of beast subordinates for just 1 point each. By the time Kiza had gotten to them, they had already gathered over 100,000 in this way. Normally, it should have been impossible for these beasts to so easily follow a new master like this, but the Gamine family had an advantage that the others didn't. And that was their comprehension of the soul. Controlling such low-talent beasts was actually extremely easy for them. Now, a great horde was charging after Lionel and the others. Lionel had thought that something like this might happen after he ran into the Libra twins. The two of them already had his general location, and they also had methods of relaying this information back, so that meant for as long as Lionel didn't notice, those two had probably been monitoring his movements. After they died and the connection was severed, the Libra and Gamine families had probably decided it was time to press forward. Those beasts. Their constitutions are weak, but they're all in the 7th dimension. It must have taken quite a bit of investment to do that. That's also a decent loophole to exploit as well. But those beasts shouldn't be native to the Gamine or Libra territories, so it must have been claimed from another family. The only families or organizations with enough capital to use this method have to be among the few most powerful. It could only be one of the Constellation families. Why are you running, Great Emperor Lionel? You've seen me. Are you not going to kill me? Lionel's expression flickered. He recognized this voice. It was one of the Libra family twins that he had met during the true selection. His gaze became colder, but he didn't respond. The speed of the beasts the coming army charged with were not slow. They had just appeared over the horizon, but they were already rapidly closing the distance. Although it was true that if it wasn't for their inhuman abilities, even seeing or hearing one another would be impossible right this moment, this distance was still close enough for them to close within a quarter hour. The only reason Lionel had been able to cover so many hundreds of kilometers of territory to begin with was because of the speed of the seventh dimension. But now that very speed was coming back to bite him. There was no way for him to make it back to his own territory in that time. If he abandoned the soul constructs, their speed would be much faster, but they would still be caught. And if they were caught without the soul constructs present, well, that ending could be imagined. Little Blackstar was especially fast, but that was in his normal form. In this form, where he used his mimicry to imagine a much larger, more powerful creature, he wasn't even a tenth as fast. The best option seemed to be to stop and fight. Their army was just shy of 200,000 strong, and Lionel still outnumbered them greatly with things the way they were. However, Lionel abandoned that idea instantly. They weren't 200,000 strong, they were 400,000 strong. Each of them rode atop of beasts that multiplied their power. On top of that, half of them were Libra family members who were charging forth in tandem. When they worked together, their power was worth at least 3 people on the lower end, far more depending on their level of genius. This size of army was already enough to clash head-on with Lionel's soul construct army and not lose out. These were true geniuses of the Constellation families, a large segment of whom had made quite a name for themselves in the Void Palace. The Morales ancestors frowned when they saw this scene. They had already known that Lionel's actions were risky, and his timing of retreat wasn't bad either. The problem was that this Kiza's timing was even better. She seemed to have been lounging around until she suddenly decided to pounce, even using a teleportation reward they had received from a dungeon to press their advantage and make sure they caught up. The Leo family had lost so miserably, and yet she had hardly needed to lift a finger. Now it looked as though Lionel was about to suffer the same fate. Even now, the young woman reclined in a sedan, sipping a drink as the twins continued to roar out derogatory comments. It seemed that the Libra and Gamine family were intent on ripping down all of the shock and awe Lionel's actions had brought to this moment. If he ended up falling this way, running in his final moments, everything else would seem to have become meaningless. The man in question, though, continued to look forward, his gaze sharp. Chapter 1981. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1981. Monster in Pretty Flesh. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1981. Monster in Pretty Flesh. The distance between the group only continued to close. Lionel took a different direction, his mind flickering with several thoughts. It would be the end of the road if his group was pincered into 2 directions, so he was constantly ensuring that there wasn't a territory in the direction he was heading. But just as he expected, within a quarter hour, they had caught up. His calculations were too precise to get something so simple wrong, something that was quite unfortunate in this case. Lionel had already restructured his army. The moment they caught up, he sent out 100,000 to block. But to his surprise, Kiza waved a fan and the formation suddenly changed. The tide of beasts, Libra and Gamine family members split. 500 from the left and right surged forward, surrounding the group of 100,000 from the front and back, engaging in a battle 1,000 against 100 times their number. 2,000 if the beasts were counted as well. The reaction was swift and strong. Lionel's eyes narrowed. It was clear that Kiza had prepared for this possibility long ahead of time. 1,000 wouldn't be able to hold back the entire tide of 100,000, obviously. But they were strong enough to protect themselves even against such numbers, and they didn't need to delay for long. The maneuverability this group had with the help of these beasts was far beyond what Lionel had. This was proven by how easily they had changed formation and swallowed up the 100,000 Lionel had sent out. They didn't have to stop them for long, they only needed to outrun them. As expected, after delaying the soul constructs, the 1,000 who had blocked them rushed out, swiftly catching up with the rest of the Libra army and leaving the constructs in their dust. At the same time, the archers turned on the backs of their beasts, raising their bows high and firing volley after volley. There was already too big of a gap for Lionel's bow domain to suppress their bow force. But even if he was close enough, they were using real bows and arrows. Unless they had been aiming for him directly, he wouldn't be able to do anything to them. Lionel's soul constructs were mowed down one after another and quickly lost a tenth of their number. Lionel hesitated for a moment, but in the end decided not to use the stamina necessary to reconstruct them. Although they continued to run forward and dodge to the best of their ability, they were limited in what they could do against so many archers. It looked like even those not skilled in the bow were firing, something that could only mean one thing: Wuxia had outfitted them with bows and arrows just for this occasion. The army swiftly caught up again. Lionel had no choice but to send out another 100,000 as a delaying tactic. However, this time, they were prepared for the separation, splitting into two as well and rushing toward the front line. Wuxia waved her fan again and the army that had just split into two split once again, dividing into four and curving around, repeating the very same action. Lionel's change in formation, although he could control the constructs with his mind whereas Wuxia had to control them with singles, was simply not as fast. These beasts were relatively normal in strength in comparison to their tiers, but their speed was exceptional. In addition, while none of the heirs Lionel had come across were above tier 3, these beasts all seemed to be. The weakest were at tier 4 and the strongest were at tier 6. Not only were they elite in speed, but even while they were average in strength, their tier was more than enough to make up for it. The army swiftly caught up once again in even less time than before. The archers continued to fire backward, but the pressure on Lionel's back was even more suffocating. Ha 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 ha. The laughter of Huan and Droit echoed through the air. They were told by Wuxia to make this process as humiliating as possible, but even without her words, they would have done so anyway. Back during the true selection, they had suffered a small loss at Lionel's hands. As geniuses who were rarely challenged by anyone, they had a deep-seated pride. Seeing Lionel run away from them like this, they felt endless satisfaction. Keep running. Your Morales family only amounts to this much. You're a disgrace. I heard your father was some monster, how'd he birth such a coward? The words and laughter of Huan and Droit were especially grating on the ears to the Morales, but to the other families, especially the ones that had the words and laughter of Huan and Droit were especially grating on the ears to the Morales, but to the other families, especially the ones that had already lost their geniuses to Lionel's ruthlessness, couldn't help but feel that some of their rage was finally being vented. The only shame was that if things continued like this, they believed that Lionel would definitely crush his badge in time. There wasn't enough pressure on him to stop him from doing so. But his death could be arranged later. If they could guarantee his humiliation right now, they would gladly accept it. The only one who didn't seem happy about this was Conan. He looked toward Wuxia with a livid expression, blood still dripping down from his lips. It should have been him. Slap. Conan grabbed the back of his head and looked back with a glare. However, when he saw who had slapped him, he looked down to the ground, gritting his teeth. It's your own fault you're in this situation. You're not strong enough to think that your fist can get you through everything. You should learn a thing or two from that woman. Better yet, it would be best if you asked for her hand in marriage. Conan shivered. Him? Spending a lifetime with a wife like that? He felt his heart grow cold. That woman was a monster in pretty flesh. Chapter 1982. Published at 7th of July 2023 12:10 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1982. Fool, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1982. Fool. Lionel's gaze was frighteningly cold. He sat on Little Blackstar's head in silence, his back as straight as a javelin. The only part of his body that seemed to be moving was his fluttering hair. As for the rest, even his eyes weren't blinking. It had been a long time since anyone had provoked him to this extent. The last time that had happened he was still a disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain. Of course, the words those few individuals had been speaking were far more sinister and disgusting. However, Lionel wasn't the type of person to take any sort of slight lightly. His patience was short, his fuse was shorter. However, at that moment, he didn't seem to have heard anything. The Libra and Gamine family couldn't gauge his reaction at all. All they saw was a perfectly straight back. Only the human domain could see the frigid air he was exuding. Those pair of pale violet eyes seemed to become the only sight worth witnessing for a moment. But after the fourth attempt Lionel made at stalling the army rushing after him, even the impact of these cold eyes seemed to have been diminished greatly. What good was looking cold and imposing if you didn't have the strength to back it up? For a moralist to swallow such insults time and time again, running with their tail tucked between their legs, it could only be said that they didn't have any other left. The Libra and Gamine army swiftly caught up once again. This time, Lionel seemed to throw all he could at the wall. 500,000 soul constructs turned around and rushed toward them. They spread themselves thin, the deepest line only being at 3 soul constructs deep while many just had 2. Lionel's goal was obvious. He wanted to cover as much latitude as possible so that the Libra and Gamine would struggle to maneuver to the right and left. However, when she saw this, Kiza's lip curled with disdain, her indifference almost palpable. This time, she didn't change the formation at all. Her fan simply snapped close and she pointed forward. Roars erupted from the Libra and Gamine army. They seemed to break out into a speed that was just about 10% faster as they surged forward. The archers turned their attention toward their backs and pointed their bows forward, unleashing a rain as the front line blasted through. This time, Kiza didn't bother to outmaneuver them. A formation as thin as this couldn't possibly stop them, they would slice through it like butter. Many could only shake their head at the sight, but they didn't know what else they would possibly try in this situation either. When Lionel tried to send out a real formation, Kiza would just outmaneuver it. If he sent out a hastily cobbled formation like the one just now, she would just target its weakness and tear through it. Every time they caught up, the air felt more suffocating, especially as the buffer of the soul constructs thinned out. 3 million soul constructs could take up a lot of space, but Lionel had sent out 3 waves of 100,000 and 1 wave of 500,000 for a total of 800,000 by now. With just another round of catching up, the archers would be close enough to target Lionel and the few following him on Little Blackstar's back directly. Those observing within the human domain could also see that Lionel was no longer able to help his soul constructs restructure themselves after they had been destroyed. Considering the fatigue between his brows, that could only mean that his stamina was reaching its limits as well while the Libra and Gamine families were entirely fresh. To make matters worse, what would Lionel even do if he managed to return to his city? He hadn't upgraded the walls like Ramon had, so they were just normal gold-grade walls that wouldn't last very long. Although he had those protectors, they too wouldn't last very long. His soul constructs were being mowed down one after another, so even if he tried to use that formation again, what good would it be if he didn't have soul constructs to use it with? And even if none of these were issues, did he even have the stamina necessary to use that formation again considering his current state? The observers knew more than the Libra and Gamine family did, so they knew about the Cloud race and Lionel's Tor family. But they weren't even in the picture currently and were too far away to ask for this. It was the most foolish. He had obviously acted in a complete panic. Do anything. A few Cloud race couldn't turn the tide at all. No matter how you looked at it, it seemed that Lionel was just trying to stretch out the inevitable. As though to confirm this, all of Lionel's remaining soul constructs suddenly turned back in unison, rushing toward the army in unison. Juan and Droit were stunned for a moment before their laughter became more uproarious. They could tell that this was a last-ditch effort. Although Lionel's previous attempt seemed pitiful, it was still the smartest thing he could have done considering the circumstances. As for this, it was the most foolish. He had obviously acted in a complete panic. Ha ha ha. Fool. Idiot. Kiza sneered without saying a word, raising her fan and unfurling it. At that moment, the army came to a halt all at once and performed 90-degree turns. Half turned to the left and another half turned to the right. They seemed to have completely ignored Lionel as they ran. They rushed to the side with great speed, circling around the charging army. Ironically, this tactic had indeed delayed the Libra and Gamine families for the longest period of time, but after they finished rounding the soul constructs, there would no longer be anything separating them from Lionel and the others. However, if Lionel had been patient, sending out sets of 100,000 at once, the cumulative time he could have delayed them would have been much greater. Clearly, in his desperation, he had only sealed his fate faster. Chapter 1983. Published at 7th of July 2023 12:10 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1983. Belief: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Noah looked back with a worried glance. Until now, the so-called catching up of the army was only to the back line of the soul constructs. Considering there were over 3 million of them running in formation, the gap between them and Lionel and the others who were on Little Blackstar's back was actually quite substantial. But this time, after they rounded the formation of soul constructs, there would be no buffer remaining. They would have no choice but to face an assault of hundreds of thousands with just a few dozen people. The outlook seemed to be incredibly bleak. When Noah looked around, he saw many worried gazes as well. Until now, everything had gone exceptionally smoothly. Everything was under Lionel's calculations and nothing had deviated from the original plan. They had had many days booked solid with meetings before the air wars even began, all so that Lionel could assure them of his plans and so that they would be ready to execute them at the greatest possible speed. Of course, the likes of Noah and the others didn't know how rare it was for Lionel to do such a thing. The fact that he had even wasted time explaining himself just went to prove how seriously he had taken these air wars. But the first time Lionel went off script, the first time he did something that could be considered to be quite risky, they seemed to be suffering for it. Noah's gaze shifted and his pupils suddenly constricted. The person in his line of sight was Aina. She looked completely calm outside of a bone-chilling coldness in her eyes. When his gaze shifted again, it landed on Lionel's brothers. Joel, Milan, Drake, Raj, Arnold, Gil, Alan, and Franco. They too were eerily calm. It shifted again and it landed on James. His gaze was different from the others, but that was only because within his sheen of calmness, there was a hint of excitement. Did they know something he didn't know? No, that was impossible. They had held all of their meetings together. Although it might have been possible for Lionel to have had secret meetings with them, Noah didn't believe that had happened. He had spent much of the last month with all of them, but more importantly than that, Lionel wouldn't do such a thing. Doing such a thing would be as good as saying he didn't trust the rest of them, but they were already a small group to begin with. In a situation where they faced off against the odds, Lionel wouldn't casually splinter them like that. Noah realized what it was very quickly: belief. Lionel hadn't said a word. He seemed to have made several mistakes. He had painted them into a corner. And yet these 10 individuals didn't doubt him for even a moment. When Noah looked again, he realized the few that had worried expressions were all the few geniuses of Earth. These were the likes of Carolus, Joyce. Even Jessica, who was by his side. Without a doubt, each one of these people were among the few that had spent the least time with Lionel. Is it really about time? Noah thought to himself. If he was in this situation, would Jessica still have belief in him to succeed? What about Carolus and the others who had the most time with him? He had fought by their side for a long time, but he still didn't know the answer to that question. Hadn't there also been a 2-decade gap since Lionel had seen his brothers? Hadn't he even had a falling out with James? Maybe Aina's belief made sense, but what about the rest of them? Noah suddenly noticed that there was another group with unwavering belief: Raylion, Aphestus, Sale and Emna. These few he knew too little about. He only vaguely understood that they had been a part of an organization Lionel had joined many years ago. They had even less reason to have such belief, but hadn't they already bet almost 30 years of their life betting on one man? Those 4 had started an organization and put their blood, sweat and tears into it for decades, all because of one sentence from Lionel. Compared to this, wasn't that something that had taken much more faith? Noah's heart trembled as he looked toward Lionel's back. He was this man's cousin and he didn't have this much faith. Where did it come from? What was the difference? Was it because he was too focused on himself? Were the others seeing something he wasn't? It seemed both obvious and not. Noah believed that Lionel was his better, but it was based on the latter's competency. When Lionel seemed to make a mistake, he felt that that competency had run its course and that Lionel was now at the end of his rope. He never really stopped to consider that there was something more to Lionel than just his talent. When you measured people by haves and have-nots, you tended to reach very binary conclusions. Lionel had never been such a person, though. He felt that talent was extremely important, yes. But he also didn't decide a person's value by such a thing. And, quite ironically, when one thought about it, when had Lionel ever thought that strength was the end-all, be-all? How many people more powerful than himself had Lionel defeated on his way to his current height? How many impossible battles had he fought? How many miracles had he created? At that moment, the rumbling of the earth reached a point where it couldn't be ignored. Noah looked back to see that the army had already finished rounding Lionel's soul constructs. They were no more than half a kilometer away, a distance that was practically meaningless. Lionel suddenly stood to his feet, calmly taking the white lion bow out and stretching it to full moon. His hair fluttered in the wind and the coldness of his gaze descended onto the approaching army. Chapter 1984. Published at 7th of July 2023 12:10 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1984. Soul-bound. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked down, with a frightening cold gaze, his expression the picture of calm. Kiza narrowed her eyes, but after a moment she relaxed. She didn't even put her defenses up. If Lionel thought he could mow her down from such a distance, he was sorely mistaken. She had already predicted that Lionel would try this. The last thing a person could do in this situation was to take out the heirs, that way victory could be secured despite a disadvantage. She had already used a similar strategy against the Leo family, so how could she fall for it now? Wouldn't that be too much of a joke? Kiza's fan snapped close once again and her sedan seemed to sparkle. It was subtle, but it was impossible for Lionel's sharp vision to miss it. Although Kiza wanted to hide it, to her it wasn't absolutely necessary for it to be hidden either. Whether Lionel knew it was there or not hardly made a difference. However, she didn't know how true this was, because she was never Lionel's target to begin with, neither were either one of the Libra twins. You finally want to fight back now? Juan's voice boomed. Tell you what, Lionel. If you admit the Morales family is trash, we can consider letting you go and giving you another chance. How about it? Daoist added. Juan laughed. He felt these words said by his brother were truly excellent. His laughter was his agreement. Of course, this chance would only be another small head start before they swiftly caught up again. However, to them, it didn't really matter whether Lionel accepted their offer or not. Their goal only seemed to be to drag Lionel and the Morales family through the mud as much as possible before claiming their victory. They wanted the entire human domain to see and witness this moment. So, thwack. The arrow was simply too fast. A soldier on the front lines didn't even have the time to react before their head burst into a rain of blood, bone, and gore. His body slowly fell to the side and was quickly trampled beneath the feet of the other charging beasts. This was the first of their army to have died since the battle began. The soul constructs couldn't shake them in the slightest, but it seemed that the moment Lionel moved, death reigned. Sishu. Thwack. Another arrow was released and another fell and was trampled. Every time Lionel pulled back his bowstring, another would die. None of the army knew who he was going to target next, but they all felt a formless pressure suddenly shrouding them. Somehow they knew at that moment that no matter what they did, so long as he decided to target them, they would be dead. It wasn't just the people who sensed the shift, but even the beasts themselves. Their blood seemed to run colder, their bones and muscles stiffening. Their speed fell. Though it was only by a small factor, to sharp-eyed practitioners like them, that slight delay was all too obvious. Lionel pulled his bowstring again and another fell. It was just a single man attacking an army of hundreds of thousands. However, it was ironically this that made it so frightening. If it was an all-out battle and people were falling left and right, the situation would still be fine. But this oppressive atmosphere where no one knew who would be targeted next and death seemed to be instant filled each one of them with a seed of fear. Male or woman, ugly or beautiful, there didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to his choices. In the beginning, Huan and Droit still tried to hurl out insults, but they noticed that every time they did, Lionel would release another arrow. It was as though Lionel was firing in retaliation for their words. Every death was slowly being transferred from Lionel's shoulders to that of the two of them. Their insults quickly became softer and less harsh, until suddenly they didn't dare to speak at all. Kiza's eyes narrowed. Lionel could obviously kill more than one at once, but he hadn't done so. He was deliberately suppressing them in this way, and by this point, the humans and the beasts had stiffened so considerably that their speed had dropped by as much as 40%. However, after a moment, Kiza sneered. Fear only worked when you had your own mind, and the current speed was dictated by the beasts. Beasts under her control. She waved her fan and a surge of force came out from her. At that moment, the eyes of the beasts glazed over and they seemed to forget everything but running. Their speed picked up again almost immediately and the distance that had begun to slowly widen began to close once again. By this point, there was already less than 200 meters between them. Lionel, though, seemed unmoved. Raising a hand, his gaze suddenly flashed. The beasts of the fallen Libra and Gamine family members were suddenly enveloped by a strong spatial force. Lionel had realized long ago that the reason Kiza was able to control the formation changes so smoothly was because she was in control of the beasts. Because of that, even after their riders had fallen, these beasts continued to run uniformly within the pack. And as a result, they were well within range of Lionel's abilities. The beasts instantly went from behind Lionel and the others to in front. Kiza frowned. What was Lionel going to do with a few dozen beasts? He couldn't be this stupid, could he? At that moment, Little Blackstar raised his large paws and pressed down with great force. The dozens of beasts were slaughtered unceremoniously. Rise, Lionel said lightly. Kiza seemed to finally understand what was happening. She had the advantage in speed because of the beasts they were riding. Lionel wanted to use his soul constructs to take advantage of this for himself. Like this, it would be much more difficult for them to catch up. However, when she realized this, Kiza finally couldn't seem to hold her laughter back. She raised her pretty head and laughed heartily, the sound being far too sweet for the sinister intention behind it. In the crowd of those watching, a gorgeous woman wearing a sparkling purple dress that clung to her curves covered her cherry lips with a glass of wine. This woman seemed to be almost an identical copy of Kiza. She was none other than Mistress Gamine, the current matriarch of the Gamine family and Kiza's mother. What a little fool. For someone who uses soul constructs, shouldn't he understand? What good is killing this first if their souls are what are bound? Lionel raised his hand, suddenly feeling a great resistance against his command. Violet fog billowed out from him, but it seemed to be obstructed by invisible chains that he couldn't shatter instantaneously. However, in that moment, the coldness in Lionel's eyes seemed to reach its peak. If the others had paid more attention, they would have noticed that there was indeed a pattern to who he had killed. All of them had ridden tier 6 beasts. This was his plan from the beginning. Or more accurately, the first of it. As for these chains, a vortex of violets suddenly expanded out from Lionel's body. Emperor's Edict. Shatter. Kiza's laughter came to an abrupt stop as a spike of pain traveled up her spine. Illusory shackles shattered like glass and dozens of beasts arose. Lionel and the others leapt down from Little Blackstar's back as the latter reverted to his true form and flickered into the void. Aina, Lionel said lightly. Aina nodded without much of a word. Chapter 1985. Published at 7th of July 2023 12:10 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1985. Sundial. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina's golden gaze began to flicker, a dense red fog coming from her body as she raised her hands. The instant Little Blackstar's form vanished and he landed on Lionel's shoulder even as the latter landed on the back of one of the soul construct beasts. The meat paste the beasts had become were suddenly ripped of their blood. She didn't seem intent on using these globules of blood immediately. She floated down toward the beast soul constructs along with everyone else, pulling them along through the air. Kiza's expression finally seemed to change. Fire. Her voice echoed through the skies, the irony being that her previous laughter had yet to finish echoing. However, she seemed to disregard this entirely as she roared out this command. Before, she was allowing the twins to continue to wear down Lionel with their words, but they had long since entered firing range of Lionel and the others. Seeing that the situation was changing, she immediately chose to forget the mind games and focus on pressing down upon them. However, when the first volley of arrows entered the skies, they immediately blinked out, the bow force that had been coating them vanished. James landed on a beast soul construct and waved a hand, causing a shield to appear before them. Without their bow force, he hardly strained at all to block this volley of arrows. In that moment, everyone had found a beast for themselves and they surged forward. Right then, the distance that had been quickly closing stopped closing entirely, and then Lionel and the others began to pull away. Lionel had only targeted Tier 6 beasts. In order to maintain the formation, Kiza had to make all the beasts uniform in speed. But that didn't mean they all had the same speed. Those that were Tier 6 were substantially faster than those that were still of Tier 4. Without the pressure of maintaining the formation of an army, Lionel could obviously allow these soul constructs to speed forward with their true potential. Kiza's expression darkened. Back in the human domain, Mistress Gemin's expression also darkened. This child's actions were only getting more and more annoying. However, outside of this darkening expression, she said nothing else. She had taught her daughter well enough to know that this wouldn't be all she had. The Morales ancestors didn't have much of a change from their original solemnity. Of course, this wasn't because they had the same faith in Kiza, but rather because they didn't feel that this changed much. Other than making things more annoying for Kiza, the situation was the same. Kiza's ambush had already forced Lionel to give up on his millions of soul constructs. His current base only had the protection of a few thousand Skies and Oryx members. Even if they were up to par in terms of talent, which they weren't, this number would be far too few. No matter how you looked at it, it felt that Lionel was once again just delaying the inevitable. Lionel stood on the back of the beast in silence. Outside of calling out Aina's name, he hadn't said much else. Even now he hadn't explained anything, and it didn't seem like there was much left to explain. Reaching their city and fighting to the death felt like the only option left. Kiza's looked toward Lionel's back, her expression dark. She didn't care about this maneuver of Lionel's, what she cared about was the loss of face. She had just been laughing, but now her voice was deathly silent. Even a fool could tell she had made a mistake. What she hated the most was that this Lionel had actually harmed her. When was the last time she had felt any sort of pain? She couldn't even quite recall. How dare he? After a split moment, she snapped her fan close. A few lines of the formation separated and Tier 6 beasts rushed forward. She removed their restrictions and had them press forward, maintaining the distance between Lionel and the others without allowing them to extend the distance. Arrows continued to fire through the air, filling it with volatile force and fireworks. Kiza had had a plan, but it would no longer work. Now that Lionel had similar maneuverability, it would be troublesome to use. However, she immediately adjusted her thoughts, pulling out a formation plate. It was in the shape of a circle and looked quite like a sundial. This was the very same teleportation treasure she had used to ambush Lionel and the others in the first place. She and the Gamin and Libra families were located on the other side of the continent, completely opposite to Lionel's current location. As such, they were also by the ocean, and with Kiza's intelligence, she had likewise taken advantage. They might not have had a large number of water force geniuses, but what they did have was a unique ability to map out large regions with just a bit of effort. By this point, they had already cleared out 2 gold-grade dungeons not available on the surface, and this sundial teleportation device was one of their rewards. It didn't have many uses. She had already used it once, and because of how large-scale the teleportation was, meaning the number of people, that is, she could only use it twice more. She didn't actually want to have to use more than one of Lionel, as she didn't know when she would get another. However, he was a variable. And she didn't like variables. Her slender fingers pressed against the device and spun the dial. Instantly, she not only used one of the remaining teleportation opportunities, but both of them. The army was split into two and they all suddenly flickered and vanished. One group was small. They were made of the elite, a number not exceeding 200. They appeared just 50 meters in front of Lionel and his group, though their backs were now facing them. With a kick of their heels, their beasts turned and they charged toward Lionel and his group. At the same time, about half of the army appeared further ahead at about half a kilometer. They split into two once again and fanned out before beginning to enclose a circle around Lionel and the others. To their backs, the remaining half of the army continued to press forward, pincering Lionel and the others from all sides. Chapter 1986. Published at 7th of July 2023 12:10 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1986. Crush them if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The change was sudden and it was difficult to react. Lionel sensed the fluctuations of spatial force and realized what was happening, but even he only had the time to fire one arrow before the group of 200 elite were upon them. Lionel's gaze remained calm, his one arrow killing a frontline elite instantaneously. His body sprawled to the floor and his beast's eyes were coated and covered in blood. Xianxia had no choice but to relinquish control of the elite squad beasts for a few reasons. First, she didn't want to suffer the backlash of Lionel severing their connection again. Secondly, she had to give the elite squad the freedom to maneuver on their own or else their combat prowess would take a hit. However, it was also due to the fact that once the beast's eyes were obstructed by flesh and blood, it tripped and fell, causing disarray in the first line and ruining the back line. Unfortunately, the damage was minimal. These few had just turned around to face Lionel and the others, and as such their speed hadn't hit a great height just yet. Due to this, they had more than enough agility remaining to react and dodge out of the way. Even so, this small delay still gave Lionel some time to analyze and react. "Raj," he said plainly. Raj slammed his chubby hands together, his large cheeks rippling. The seriousness of his gaze was piercing as the ground rumbled. Lionel knew firsthand that the hardest force to manipulate in a powerful world was Earth force. It had been one of his greatest limitations back when he was at Void Palace. But this wasn't the Void Palace. Raj was in the 7th dimension, and he also wasn't the same as before. He had fought many rounds with the Perfection Stone and he had meditated on the Earth Force mantra for more hours than he could remember. Bang! The earth rippled and suddenly hardened. Spikes of shimmering diamond and crystal collapsed and fused out from the ground before surging up and ripping through the disorganized group of elites. Blood rained down from the skies above and Lionel led his small group to charge up the side of these crystalline spikes. They burst out from the curtain of blood, leaping over the small troop of elites and landing dozens of meters away. The soul constructs dashed forward, but up ahead, the encirclement of warriors had already solidified. It seemed that Xianxia was already prepared for this possibility. Not only was there a blockage ahead, but the elites would likely recover quite quickly as well. Lionel slowly put his bow away, retrieving his black rod. Dense, dark fog billowed from its body, rising like a tide and forming a menacing blade on both ends. Despite the movement of the beast beneath his feet, Lionel seemed completely stable. "James, Raylion." Lionel spoke calmly. James swung the large shield that protected their backs forward and expanded it, his gaze flashing with a strong light. Then, he pushed it forward with all his might. At the same time, Raylion raised his hands. A powerful telekinetic force took shape and fused with James' forward momentum. Like a mighty battering ram, the shield smashed into the front line of warriors. The Libra and Gamine family didn't remain idle. They roared themselves, sending forward the strongest strikes they could muster in short order. However, to their shock, James' barrier only trembled one or twice before it stopped completely. The speed with which James could move his barriers depended on how thick they were. Usually, to make a barrier this thick, he would have to give up on its agility. However, with Raylion supporting from the back, bang! 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 In unison, Raylion and James' eyes flashed. The forward momentum of the barrier tilted, the bottom leaning forward and its top leaning back. After throwing the front line off balance and clearing them, many couldn't stop themselves from rolling up the energy shield, their beasts thrown into disarray as their bones snapped and cracked. "Drake," Lionel said lightly. Drake pulled a pair of pistols of his holsters, raising both of his hands up as what looked like crosshairs rotated in his eyes. A blazing intent pumped his heart as he began to shoot. Every time someone was thrust over the energy shield, he fired. One shot. One kill. Lionel brandished his spear with one hand and used his free hand to scratch Little Blackstar's head. The latter seemed to wake up from his slumber and vanished from Lionel's shoulder. Lionel shifted to the side of the formation. At the same time, Joel mirrored his actions. Both of them took hold of their polearms, their battle intent soaring as they swung out. Around the edges of the energy shield, enemies tried to wrap around and target the sides of their formation, but they didn't have the momentum to make any strong headway. Every time one managed to make it around, they would find the end of Lionel or Joel's blade, their bloodied and mangled corpses being left in their wake. It hardly seemed as though Lionel and the others had slowed down at all. The gap that had been about 200 meters had only shrunk to about 180 or so. Although it was still somewhat closing as some loss of speed was inevitable, it was nowhere as fast as it should be. Lionel gave out command after command and the army of Libra and Gamine were being shredded to pieces. His voice became like the call of the reaper, the collapse of the guillotine, a suffocating, omnipresent pressure. He didn't need to speak at all to relay these orders, and yet he had done so. Every time that soft, calm voice echoed, dozens would fall. Even so, the distance continued to close and the fatigue of the small group was only continuing to accumulate. Daylight seemed so close and yet so far away. The line of enemies was too thick and there was only so much Lionel and Joel's polearms could do. The moment they slowed to a certain point, being swallowed from all sides was the only result. Kiza's eyes flashed. "It's about time you four took action. Crush them." The two pairs of Libra family twins' eyes narrowed, slowly retrieving their weapons. Indeed, it was about time to end this. Chapter 1987. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1987, meaningless if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Juan and Droid, along with Hewlett and Druid, surged forward. However, what was odd was that although they both seemed to be running hard, only one of each twin suddenly sped forward, their speed so fast that they overtook their own beasts and caught up with Lionel and the others in what felt like an instant. Lionel didn't turn back, but he could already sense the change. He knew what this was. The twins could share their strengths between one another, in exchange for one being much slower, the other could become much faster in an instant. At that moment, Juan and Hewlett pulled at their waists, taking out a pair of rope darts. The rope twirled around their bodies before piercing forward with a fierce momentum. Kiza had been observing all the while. She had realized that although Lionel was constantly handing out orders, there were some among the group that he didn't give orders to. At the same time, these few he didn't give orders to also seemed to have the worst expressions and reactions to the situation. She was a person quite used to playing with and manipulating the minds of others. How could she not sense this crack in Lionel's armor? As such, the moment she ordered the four forward, she told them exactly who to target. Most of Lionel's group seemed to just be along for the ride, and even with Lionel's small victories, their expressions remained solemn. These sort of weak links deserved to be poked and prodded at. The rope darts whistled through the air, their speed faster than any whip and overtaking even an arrow in the blink of an eye. Juan's dart appeared before Joyce while Hewlett's appeared between careless brows. The harsh whistling stung their eyes and they couldn't seem to react in time. At that moment, Noah unleashed a roar, leaping up and swinging down his saber hard. Bang! Bang! A strong reverberating impact traveled up Noah's arm. He wanted to use the momentum of the clash to return to his beast and continue speeding forward, but the twins seemed to see through him. Their rope darts turned from a feeling like a piercing arrow to becoming as lithe and gentle as flowing silk. They wrapped around Noah's saber and pulled. Noah noticed the change instantly and wanted to pull back, even ultimately choosing to abandon his saber, but it was too late. That split moment between their twins' pull and his release slowed his momentum far too much. He fell well short of his beast's back, landing heavily on the ground, weaponless and suddenly surrounded by enemies. Noah's gaze sharpened and he roared immediately. He didn't hesitate at all to activate his ability index and soar to over 5 meters tall, his skin glistening with a crystalline color as he hardened it. He leapt backward with as much strength as he could muster, punching out twice, then thrice. The twins' gaze narrowed, but they had already succeeded. Their rope darts soared to the skies but entirely backward. At the same time, their twins, still stuck trying to catch up, threw their own rope darts forward. The ends of their rope darts wrapped around one another and locked into place across hundreds of meters of air. With a tug, Huan and Hewlett pulled Droid and Druid through the air. With one swift motion, Huan and Hewlett used the drag to pull back from the strongest impact of Noah's punches as the latter's saber clanged to the ground. At the same time, they sent Droid and Druid forward, the two of them appearing before Noah's in the blink of an eye. Bang! Bang! The two twins kicked out against Noah's chest. He might have been more powerful in this state, but he was also a much bigger target. Noah felt his skin crack and his organs rumble. He took heavy steps backward, blood already leaking from his lips after a single exchange. Droid and Druid's rope darts untangled from Huan and Hewlett's. The instant they landed on the ground, their wrists flickered, their rope darts whistling through the air with a harsh whistle. One targeted Noah's heart while the other targeted his knee. Kiza watched this from the distance with a cold smile gracing her cherry lips. Her sedan continued to move forward at a smooth pace, almost as though she didn't care about catching up at all. She was content to watch her chess pieces move across the board. This was what thrilled her. It didn't matter what move Lionel made now. Would he ignore Noah? Sure, he could do that, but then the fragmentation between him and the discontent half of his subordinates would only increase. That would only make it even easier for her to take advantage of these problems. Would he turn back to save him? Even better. Then he could forget about charging out of this encirclement entirely. Kiza had only just finished this thought when a little black mink suddenly flickered into existence, landing on Noah's shoulder. Yip! Yip! Noah tried to block, but he suddenly stood in shock as the rope darts phased through his body as though he wasn't there at all. His body only slightly rippled and he felt a breeze of cold air as though a draft had suddenly come by. Droid and Druid pulled their rope darts back, their eyes filled with hints of surprise. What had just happened? Kiza raised an eyebrow. Shadow Sovereign. A little interesting, but meaningless. The trap is already prepared to close. As Droid and Druid were somewhat in shock, Hewlett and Huan had already jumped back into the fray, their rope darts spiraling toward Joyce and Careless once again. This time, there was no Noah to cover for them. Careless' body erupted with a strong spatial force, the space around him cracking like glass as he punched out. Space coated his knuckles, but the instant the rope dart met his attack, he was sent flying backward. Chapter 1988. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1988. Bonus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Joyce's expression changed as well. She was a fist expert, but without having her feet beneath her, the strength she could muster was limited. Seeing Joyce in trouble, Franco had long since moved. Just when it seemed her head would be pierced through, he had jumped from the back of his beast onto hers, reaching out to grab the rope dart out of the air. Hewlett sneered, her usually pretty features looking quite sinister at the moment. Trying to grab her weapon? Did he have a death wish? Franco's body shuddered as he made contact, his entire arm going numb. He was blown backward, his body landing amidst their running beasts and rolling onto the ground. Franco! Joyce leapt down without hesitation. Suddenly, it wasn't just Noah who was caught in a no-man's land. Joyce, Careless and Franco had all been knocked from their beasts, stuck in the midst of two charging armies. As though this wasn't bad enough, the small troop of elites they had left behind had swiftly caught up and were now bearing down as the first wave. Kiza smiled, swirling the wine glass in her hand. She and her mother took a long sip at the same time, their hearts filled with the sweet feeling of victory. What they liked the most was to watch their enemies writhe beneath their fingers, unable to extricate themselves. Lionel's expression was frighteningly cold. He had been occupied with the charging army and couldn't easily extricate himself. By the time he could, the damage was done. His spear whipped outward, a light roar clearing the surrounding 5-meter space as he turned back without hesitation. Whether it was for his cousin or his brother Franco, how could abandoning them ever be a choice? By this point, Druid and Droid had recovered from the shock of Noah's survival. They flicked their wrists, one of them targeting the little mink and the other targeting Noah. So long as they fused their attacks with enough force, phasing through them wouldn't be so easy. As expected, Little Blackstar had no choice but to leap forward, brandishing his little claws as he sliced down with several dark force scythes to block. Noah prepared to take on Droid's strike, but he suddenly coughed. The damage of the previous kicks he had taken head-on were taking their toll. But then, not only had Druid and Droid kicked him, but they had amplified their strength through Juan and Hewlett. He couldn't gather up any strength without his entire body shuddering. He could only watch with despair as the rope dart approached. But right then, his despair turned quite savage. There was little he felt that he could control in his life right now, but he could at least die without being a coward. He roared out, his body expanding to 10 meters. Ignoring the pain, he punched out with everything he had, his momentum overbearing. Even so, bang! Noah's entire right arm shattered and he was sent flying back. Lionel swiftly caught up, catching Noah as his body shrunk. At this moment, his expression wasn't just cold, it was frighteningly dark. The air rippled around him, combusting and collapsing. The group couldn't possibly continue forward without Lionel. The moment they saw that he had turned back, they did so as well. They were his brothers, and then there was his Aina. How could any one of them leave him behind? The army bore down from all sides, clamping until there was no direction to go. Whether it was forward, backward, to the left or to the right, there was nothing to see but a sea of Libra and Gamine family members. The night air was suffocatingly humid. The blood and sweat of countless warriors made it heavy and difficult to breathe. There were no steps left to take. High up, the Morales ancestors could only sigh. Though it was valiant that Lionel hadn't hesitated to turn back, it seemed that this choice had actually sealed his fate. Kiza waved her fan gently, relishing in the breeze as her sedan slowly caught up. The foul stench of blood and sweat didn't seem to ruin her appetite at all, in fact it only seemed to make her wine taste all the sweeter. Her beasts rose her sedan into the air, giving her an excellent view. Seeing Lionel and the others encircled in this fashion, her smile only became brighter. No longer running? She asked lightly. Lionel didn't respond. He seemed to be checking on Noah, but there really was nothing to check. While his life wasn't in danger, for now, his ability to fight was likely shot. At least that was the case before Lionel's palms began to glow with a strong light force. Interesting, Kiza smiled, seemingly indifferent to Lionel's disregard. What good was acting cool and aloof when you had lost before the eyes of everyone? Indeed, you have the capital to be calm. Even for me, I can't stop you from crushing your badge and giving up right this moment. Though you might lose face for wagging your tongue harder than your fists, losing a bit of face is definitely better than dying. Kiza nodded to herself. At this point, Juan and Droid didn't even bother to pile on. Nothing they could say could ever be as sinister as what this woman's venomous tongue could conjure up. But, it is a shame. I was looking forward to what a horse spawn could do. I didn't expect you to be so pathetic. Kiza tipped her wine glass over the side of her sedan with an expression of disgust. The blood and gore didn't seem to bother her, but these words seemed to have left a disgusting taste in her mouth. No, it wasn't the words, but rather the mention of that person. I should have known that a woman only good for enticing the husbands of others wouldn't have any redeeming qualities, but it's as the saying goes, we all have our vices. Your mother's vice just happens to be far more disgusting than most others. The more she spoke, the deeper the disgust on Kiza's face seemed to become. It was as though she was recalling everything she hated in an instant. I can't stand the look of his face anymore. Kill him or get him to quit and run with his tail tucked between his legs. I can't be bothered to care anymore. About here should be good. Lionel spoke lightly as he stood to his full height, fresh blood falling from his blade as though it couldn't be tarnished. What did you say? Kiza sneered. Rumble. The ground began to tremble and a formation suddenly rose out from the ground, forming a dome over the surroundings. Suddenly, those watching from the outside all had changed expressions. That location. Wasn't it where Lionel's original city used to be? At that moment, a realization overcame them. Lionel had added his formation separately, it wasn't part of the city. When he used the city relocation reward, it had only moved the city itself, not what was around it. In this battlefield filled with dried ground and rubble, buried beneath it was a perfectly pristine formation. Lionel finally looked up after Noah could breathe smoothly without his aid. However, his gaze carried a fiendish air. Crimson flickered in his eyes, a demonic aura billowing out from him in waves. He met Kiza's gaze for the first time since the chase had begun. I'm going to enjoy killing you. Chapter 1989. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1989. Ash, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Kiza's heart skipped a beat, her pupils constricting. However, after a moment, she slowly managed to calm down. She realized what was happening and made the same deductions as everyone else a step quicker. She didn't know a lot about this formation. Although she had been monitoring Lionel all this time using Libra family twins, the level of clarity their methods could bring was limited. While they could cover very large regions and their methods were difficult to detect, there was a trade-off that came with that as well. Even so, she knew enough to know that this formation was the formation that Lionel had used to clear the gold grade trial, and also further knew that he needed soul constructs to make use of it. Even though many had died in this battle, they were ultimately just a drop in the bucket. They weren't nearly enough to turn the tide. In addition, she had seen through this formation's obvious weakness. It only worked within the bounds of the formation itself. Even if Lionel had some other trick up his sleeve, it would only take a slight step out to deal with this situation. That didn't even mention the fact it greatly drained Lionel. Not only was their army stronger than a 3 million strong gold grade tide, Lionel was already feeling hints of fatigue. How long could he possibly use the formation? All of these matters made Kiza sneer, but right then, all she saw in Lionel's eyes was disregard. He looked at her not like an enemy, not like a beauty, not like a peer, but rather like a lamb on a chopping block. She wasn't just an annoyance, she was an inferior life form. Despite the fact she had the high ground, it felt as though she was already being trampled beneath his feet. Lionel took out 3 cracked city cores and pressed them together at the same time. One had failed a silver grade upgrade while 2 had failed a bronze grade upgrade. Taking the silver grade upgrade failure as their core, they combined into a new bronze grade village core. Before anyone could wonder what Lionel was doing, he had already swept through and accepted the silver grade upgrade challenge. Kiza's expression changed. That was impossible. According to the rules, an upgrade challenge couldn't be triggered when there were a number of enemies within a certain distance of your territory. She couldn't understand how Lionel could even accept the upgrade when it shouldn't have been available in the first place. But even so, what was the point of this? A realization overcame Kiza, but it was already too late. Lionel's finger flickered and just as the tide formed, a bolt of lightning descended from the skies, killing them all. He had activated a silver grade instant clear reward. Suddenly, outside an encirclement of thousands, 12,000 soul constructs appeared, each one of them with flickering red-gold flames in their eyes. A demonic aura rose into the skies, a vicious momentum causing the dark clouds above to roll and rumble. It was only 12,000, not even 10% of the number here, but their pressure was even greater. At that moment, they all extended their hands and a spear appeared in each one of their palms. Some were long and wiry, some were scaled, others were short and stocky, all of them exuded a different sort of aura, but they were all, without fail, of the life grade. Lionel's body trembled just once as a blinding bronze aura rose from him. His halo descended and his body was coated in his second-tier armor. However, rather than billowing with radiant blue fog, a violent torrent of red-gold flames billowed out from its vents. Everywhere he stepped, the ground crumbled to ash, large pits forming beneath him. Bang! The red-gold flames erupted from Lionel's back, forming a large pair of overbearing wings. "Don't move." Lionel's words were calm, but the air seemed to crackle and pop as he spoke them. It took a while for others to understand that he wasn't referring to his enemies at all. Instead, he was talking to his allies. His meaning was clear: if they moved, he couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't die too. Lionel suddenly flickered and vanished. A heat wave rippled across the battlefield as his wings of Scarlet Star Force trembled just a single time. This wall of heat crashed into the wall of enemies around him. The weak among them were immediately burnt to ashes, rows of several hundred fell in droves, the residual heat alone being far too much for them to handle. However, what was even more shocking was that they weren't even Lionel's target to begin with. He appeared before Huan first, his palm stretching out for the latter's head. "Huan!" Droit roared, sending his rope dart forward with the greatest strength he could muster. The sound barrier boomed and the air whistled, a large accumulation of spiraling force appearing before Lionel's forehead. However, Droit's rope dart seemed to meet an impenetrable barrier an entire meter from Lionel. Then, under his astonished gaze, the rope dart trembled and then fell into a rain of ash. Droit's eyes widened. That rope dart, it was a top-of-the-line gold-grade treasure. How could it possibly just? Lionel's hand landed on Huan's forehead. Not once did he look in Droit's direction the entire time. It was as though he had already expected them to be able to put up no resistance at all. Bang! Huan's head exploded like a watermelon, but even the rain of blood and gore didn't last long before it was burnt to ash. Without the protection of Huan's force, his flesh had no ability to protect itself in Lionel's presence. "Huan!" Droit roared, his gaze turning bloodshot. "I'll kill you." The words had hardly left Droit's mouth when he registered that Lionel was already before him. The world felt eerily silent at that moment. All he could hear was a high-pitched whining. He looked down at his chest, only to find that an arm had already ripped through him and pulled his heart out, burning it to ash. Chapter 1990. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 1990. Shameless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Hewlett and Druid's eyes opened wide. While they were also geniuses of the Libra family and were stronger than Huan and Droit, this was only because the two of them were older. They fell into a middle generation similar to Valerie and the Gold Dark brothers, and as such had had more time to acclimate and grow within the seventh dimension. However, in terms of talent, they were both inferior to those two of the so-called Cataclysm generation. Seeing the two of them die like this, and so directly, their gazes couldn't help but turn crimson at all. Although nothing was set in stone, they had known for a long time that Huan and Droit would likely become their husbands despite the love they clearly had for Kiza. But now they had been made widows before they would accept such a reality. Their fury rose like a tsunami, but it seemed that they hadn't noticed that today, they already finished their role as the hunter. From this point forward, they were nothing but prey. Lionel appeared in the skies above Hewlett, his foot stomping down just once. Bang! The sole of Lionel's feet and Hewlett's back didn't even properly connect. A wave of heat and wall of wind seemed to fuse into one, descending down with the density of a mighty pillar as she was drilled into the ground. A strong aura of destruction caused Hewlett to spit up a mouthful of blood. Her skin of force quickly resisted, but she could feel it being peeled away inch by inch. If that destructive aura touched her, even without experiencing it personally, she knew that she would become nothing but a pile of ash just like Huan and Droit before her. Hewlett. Druid screeched. What are you all doing? Kill them all. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and yet they were all frozen by one man. How could they be any more pathetic? Druid rushed forward, her steps becoming akin to a floral dance and her rope darts spinning around her body like the body of a voluminous dress. The army had been shaken by the flap of Lionel's wing. Ever since the first wave of destruction, they hadn't stopped. It felt like they weren't facing flames at all, they were facing the fiery abyss of hell, a place where you could only be chewed up, but there would be nothing at all left to spit out. Even so, they had no choice but to follow Druid's orders. They roared out, swarming toward Lionel, but at that moment, the soul constructs that had been completely immobile suddenly moved. The ground shook as they took a step and thrust out together. In that instant, with just a single attack, over 10,000 of them had fallen. Lionel struck out with his palm, meeting Druid's attack head-on. Bang! She crashed into the ground below as Lionel kicked downward once again, driving Hewlett even further into the ground. He didn't seem to have registered that she was a petite woman at all. His mind projected nothing but a meat bag. Druid surged into the air, a large amount of water force breathing life into the surroundings and seemingly trying to fight back against Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. Lionel's head tilted in her direction. His eyes seemed to shine through the visor of his divine armor, the indifference of his expression palpable. You're annoying. Emperor's Edict, activated, and Druid's water force was snuffed out as though it was a weak flame. Lionel appeared before her, punching out just once. His fist didn't even connect with her skull, but it shattered into a rain of brain matter and bone. It was as though anything that entered a meter radius of Lionel was only destined for one path, death. Lionel landed on the ground, his heel driving into the back of Juan's head. The last sight she saw in her life was the endless darkness of Earth. Lionel took a step forward. His gait wasn't fast at all. Everywhere he passed, more and more warriors seemed to be roaring and rushing toward him. But without fail, every time they came close, they burst into a rain of ashes. However, he didn't spare them a single glance, his gaze entirely focused on Kiza. Kiza's chest heaved, but she barely managed to maintain a calm expression. If it wasn't for the bead of sweat falling down her brow under the heat, one would have thought that she was completely unruffled. She felt around for her badge and only sighed a breath of relief when she felt it in her palm. Knowing that she could crush it at any time put her completely at ease. What? Are you very angry? Kiza sneered. What good is your range? Will it change your mother? Her actions? Everyone knows the truth already. Plus, after today, everyone will know how shameless the Morales are. You just blatantly allowed him to break one of the rules of the air wars. Do you think this is victory? I've already crushed you, and once I leave this place and enter the real world where you can't twist and bend rules to your will, they'll crush you again. Kiza's sneer deepened. She seemed to want to wait until Lionel got closer. She wanted Lionel to try and approach her only to fail in the end. She wanted to see the despair on his face as she disappeared and he could do nothing about it. At the same time, she wanted to humiliate the Morales family. How dare they cheat? This was the only explanation she had for Lionel seemingly breaking one of the rules by activating the upgrade challenge in their presence. However, Lionel's expression didn't change in the slightest. His speed remained the same, his slow walk forward feeling like footsteps grinding against her heart. Lionel closed the distance between the two. Not a single person could seem to stop him. By the time he could probably reach out and touch her, the remaining of the army had already turned to run, only to find themselves being mowed down one after another by Lionel's soul constructs. Go on. Crush it, Lionel said lightly. Kiza suddenly trembled. Why did he sound like that? Do it. Crush it. Lionel's voice suddenly came out in a roar and Kiza reacted as though she had been commanded. Her palms subconsciously squeezed, the fear on her face clear. However, when her eyes opened, they couldn't help but widen. She was still in the same place. No. No. How can you be so shameless? She couldn't believe it. The Morales family were bold enough to flaunt their rules like this? So easily? Without the slightest care for the reaction of everyone else? Where was her mother? Why hadn't they stopped this farce yet? Why was she still here? Save me. Lionel suddenly grabbed her hair and drove his knee into her face. Kiza entered a daze. She felt the world spinning. Her nose bones entered her face and her front row of teeth all shattered. However, she didn't even have the luxury of flying back, her hair still firmly in Lionel's grip. Chapter 1991. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1991. Reverse scale. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Mistress Gemin's expression froze, her glass of wine suddenly cracking in her hands. Morales family. It wasn't just her, many others looked toward the Morales family at once, looking for an explanation. The change was too sudden and it felt like the only thing that could facilitate it would be chilling. However, the Morales family didn't seem to feel like explaining anything. This non-answer only caused the atmosphere to grow more and more heated. Release my daughter. You're all wrong. The voice seemed to cut through the atmosphere, and it was even more shocking when many realized who it was. Of all the people to be speaking up, it was actually the scorned Queen Beauty, and from what it seemed, she was actually defending the Morales family. That formation, for all intents and purposes, is the mind of Lionel Morales. It is separate from the constructed world of the Air Wars as it is built on its own dream force. He can break as many rules as he wants within it so long as those rules don't fundamentally break the logic of the Air Wars world and the action he is executing doesn't require feedback. The badge didn't work because he simply didn't want it to, it's that simple. For example, Lionel still needed to use the silver grade clear reward and couldn't just use his formation to bypass it entirely. This was because he needed the Air Wars world to provide him with not only the soul constructs he was currently using, but also the rewards that would come with such an upgrade. However, he didn't need this sort of feedback with Kiza's badge. In fact, he wanted to cut off this feedback entirely so that the world couldn't register that she had died. So long as he wanted to complete a task that didn't need the Air Wars world, he could do it. Mistress Gemin's head snapped towards Cynthia's, a malevolent expression hardly hidden in the depths of her eyes. At that moment, it looked like she wanted to devour everything around her. She didn't even seem to register the fact that her wine had spilled all over her dress. What was this supposed to mean? Was she just supposed to watch her daughter die, then? Ancestor Hito opened his eyes, looking towards Cynthia with a deep gaze. He hadn't explained this point when he described Lionel's formation earlier, but it seemed that this woman had seen through it anyway. Indeed, she was quite a genius. He had an advantage that came from the world being created by his hand. He could sense the differences and the changes Lionel was causing. But Cynthia had no such references to rely on. She used nothing more than a small explanation from him and she extrapolated the rest of the information on her own. Of course, she didn't do this out of the kindness of her heart. If the Air Wars ended here, it would be much more difficult to take Lionel's life. She ultimately didn't want a domain war either, so it was for the greater good if Lionel were to die within the Air Wars themselves, that way the Morales family wouldn't be able to say anything. If anything, this was only positive. The more the human domain saw of Lionel's viciousness, the easier it would be. Cynthia's gaze flashed with a hint of coldness. Bang! 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 Lionel treated Kiza like a ragdoll, his actions savage and entirely unrestrained. If there was anything he held back in, it was the retreat of his Scarlet Star Force. He wouldn't allow this kind of woman to die so easily. Holding on to her hair, he smashed her head into the ground several times. It was only when he thought that he might accidentally shatter her skull did he pull back, lifting her high and grabbing one of her wrists. Kiza, whose head was spinning and was having a hard time seeing straight, didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Her eyes suddenly opened wide and her mouth, missing several teeth, released a blood-curdling screech. Her arm was ripped out of its socket, a current of blood following the arc of Lionel follow-through. A flicker of a flame pulsed in Lionel's eyes as her wound was seared close in stomach-churning fashion. The air was filled with the stench of burning meat and blood and carnage. Bang! 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 Lionel was absolutely relentless. He seemed to have entirely forgotten that there was an entire army around him, but then again, not a single one of them even dared to get close to him. Many of them had a deep fear of Kiza in the depths of their heart. Seeing her being treated like this left them shivering uncontrollably. Lionel's gaze didn't even seem like that of a human anymore. It was as though no amount of beating could possibly allow Kiza to atone for her sins. Her face was entirely unrecognizable, her clothing was in rags, but even what should have been the soft and supple skin beneath was entirely ruined. Mistress Gamine could see nothing but red, but she was only in the 7th dimension. Although she had strong control over the Gamine family, the ancestor wouldn't allow her to do as she pleased, especially when the Omen family had also already spoken. However, what Lionel did next made her faint directly. Her force went so far out of control that her skin burst, red streaks running down her rolled-back eyes, ears and nose. "You like talking about whores a lot, right?" Lionel's voice seemed to rise from an icy hell. Kiza shuddered. She wished for nothing more than to pass out, but Lionel had somehow managed to stop her from doing so. She could feel every break of the flesh, every shatter of her bones, every strong impact. She had never experienced such suffering in her entire life. Suddenly, she was tossed out, her body landing heavily in an encirclement of the beasts she had been so proud to be in control of just moments ago. The eyes of the human domain widened. They knew that from that moment onward, that fiendish gaze of Lionel's would be imprinted onto their nightmares. And at the same time, they knew never to touch his reverse scale. The echoes of Kiza's screams sent jolts of electricity down their spines. Chapter 1992. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1992. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1992. Key to victory. Ancestor Alvaro cleared his throat as Ancestor Hito waved a hand, blocking the human domain from the option of seeing that scene. "His temper seems to be a bit." Alvaro coughed lightly. He seemed to have no care for the fairer sex at all. The echoes of Kiza made even them as ancestors shudder. The ancestors of the Gamine family had expressions as dark as night. Kiza might not be directly related to most of them, but she was still the pride and joy of the family, only behind that of her mother. Plus, as most of their upper echelon were women, they were particularly sensitive to this brand of revenge that Lionel had chosen, and it seemed that Lionel had acted this way despite being more than smart enough to know this. They wanted nothing more than to rip Lionel limb from limb, but Lionel himself only seemed to be looking for more targets. He ripped through what remained of the Libra and Gamine armies, his momentum not dying down in the slightest. Compared to the Gold Grade army, this was even easier. The Gold Grade army didn't have the emotions and fears of humans, they only knew how to keep charging and aiming for the kill. However, this army had just seen their leaders systematically defeated one after another, their comrades slaughtered with nothing more than the flap of a pair of wings. How could they still have the will to fight? They were practically pieces of meat on a chopping board. Cynthia's deductions were indeed correct about the formation, but even though they were correct, they were too limited in scope because not many understood what it really meant for this formation to become an extension of Lionel's dream world. When Lionel usually deployed his starry spirit domain, his dream world was projected, but it only really became a part of the world, layering atop of it. With this formation, though, his dream world was the world. The laws, the rules of physics, the logic, it was all dictated by him as though he was lucid dreaming. In fact, that was the name of this self-created formation, the lucid dream formation. Lionel had only exposed a small portion of its abilities, one part due to him liking to keep trump cards in his back pocket, but another part was due to the sheer strain. At the moment, the formation was just a work in progress. He wouldn't be able to use it with true freedom until he entered the 8th dimension at least, but by then it would be so refined and perfected that it would become nigh untouchable. The entire Libra and Gamine family armies were wiped out. By this point, there didn't seem to be any other powers on the supercontinent that could even begin to threaten Lionel. However, Lionel's next step seemed quite odd. First, he placed the silver city he had just formed down and let its walls take shape. After a while, he communicated with the Tour, currently run by the Cloud race, and they took over all of the territory that had once been the Leo, Libra, and Gamine families. Like this, the Dayside supercontinent was split between two supreme powers, but in reality, everyone watching on the outside was very much aware that Lionel, the sixth-dimensional existence who should have been among the first to fall, had conquered an entire continent for himself. While there were still some powers here and there, it was only a matter of time for them all to be wiped out and for the continent to truly be unified. Rho Alpha D Alpha SN knew at the same time. Despite the victory, Lionel knew when to take a step back as well. After his aggressive forward step, rather than openly claiming the continent, he maintained the illusion of the continent being controlled by two strong powers. In addition, he used his silver-grade city like a dummy capital city. While placing it within the same mountain range his original city had been in, it was difficult to tell exactly which of the two was the main city, especially when he ordered some soldiers of the Oryx and Skies to manage it. More importantly than that, he had monopolized the resources of an entire continent for himself. No matter how you looked at it, Lionel was by far and away firmly within first place. However, there wasn't a hint of satisfaction on Lionel's face. Just a pair of families like the Libra and Gamine had actually pushed him to this extent. By the time he started targeting the other continent, they would be even more established, with even more subordinates. The gap would only grow larger and larger. Lionel's expression was dark, he only seemed to react when a soft hand slipped into his. Aina smiled. She's already suffered the worst kind of humiliation and death. There's no need to keep being mad, because then she wins, right? Lionel blinked. Indeed, he wasn't mad about the odds he was being faced with, he was just still pissed off about Kiza. Maybe the fact that she had almost forced him into a corner made him a bit more sensitive about another potentially doing the same, but the root was ultimately her. He had every confidence that he would be able to crush everything in his path, he should just forget about such trash. Lionel smiled and nodded, the heavy atmosphere suddenly vanishing with the wind. Let's return, we have work to do after resting. Lionel and the others entered the nearest outpost and teleported back to the gold-grade base. Lionel's mind flickered with many thoughts. His formation was powerful, but its greatest weakness was its lack of mobility. Even setting it up took over half a day, it just wasn't feasible to use continuously. He would have to put his eggs in a different sort of basket. Soon, the Umbra family would return with the details of the supercontinent and he would redeploy the Cloud race that had been freed up after the territories he had sent them into were destroyed. They had made a lot of things smoother for him, and as the numbers of subordinates on the other side grew, it would be even easier for them to infiltrate and relay information back to him. For now, though, he would rest. When he awoke, he would begin to take his first steps into the ocean. The key to victory was within. Chapter 1993. Published at 11th of July 2023 5:41 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1993. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1993. His littlest Nova seems to be leaving us without much of a choice, Ancestor Alvaro said lightly. With things being like this, it was clear that there was no option remaining for the Morales. They had already known ahead of time, but there was simply no dodging things this time. Even the most pacifist among them could see it as bright as day. War was looming over the horizon. That child of the Omen family seemed to still be trying to avoid war, but the method by which she wanted to do so was by killing littlest Nova. She could only be said to be naive if she believed that this would stop things. They knew Velasco well enough to know that he wouldn't care if Lionel died to those of his generation, even if they had a 20-year advantage. He was just that kind of madman. But they also knew Velasco well enough to know that if his wife was enraged, then he was enraged. If his wife pointed, he would do it. If his wife wanted someone dead, they would die. In truth, Velasco was even more of a madman than they knew. To him, his seed should be capable of facing off against the entire human domain without trouble. Now that Lionel had 7th dimensional strength, he had grown up enough to maneuver the world on his own. Of course, all of this was irrelevant so long as Alienor shed a single tear. Even if the Morales did nothing, the Omen would face the wrath of Velasco. People knew too little about Alienor and the Ascension Empire. If not, they would know that facing the wrath of these two entities was definitely something to take note of as well. Alpha D Alpha S Eta Theta Nu Epsilon, he's decisive, more decisive than the rest of us. The moment the human domain showed such intentions, we should have already known that war was inevitable. He's already treating it as such. At this point, he's only slaughtering their futures right before them and staking his claim to this generation. The Morales family looked around them and it seemed as though half of those present were seeing red. Most would have already left by now if not for the fact they wanted to wait to see Lionel fall. They were like gambling addicts, gritting their teeth and waiting for the chips to fall correctly. Of course, there were some with far more sinister intentions than just that. If it wasn't sowing discord, they were definitely lying in wait. If by some miracle Lionel really managed to make it out, escaping the clutches of the countless geniuses of his generation, they would be here. They really wanted to see if the Morales family truly dared to face off against the entire human domain alone. When Lionel returned to his city, after delegating some tasks, he nearly collapsed. He entered the pod for an entire 2 hours, the worth of over a week. His gaze couldn't help but sharpen. He had thought he felt fine, but this amount of rest period painted a completely different picture. The reality was that there was something he had done that was hidden from Cynthia Omen, and that was using his formation to more freely control his Scarlet Star Force. He only remembered feeling a fiery, burning rage that was threatening to boil over at every moment. Rho Alpha D Alpha S and Nu Oh man now, seeing how long it had taken his body to recover despite him feeling fine, Lionel realized something else. It seems that it's already affecting my mental state. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Wise Star Order had already warned him that there would be a price to pay for the oversized growth of his Scarlet Star Force innate node, but he thought he had made great progress already. If he was measuring things by what Wise Star Order had said, he essentially needed to reach the state of being able to freely use his Scarlet Star Force within a third-dimensional world to be free of any potential ill effects. He was already making good progress toward that. He had around 100 years to succeed, and it had only been around a year or two since he had this conversation with Wise Star Order. So he should still have plenty of time left. The good news was that the effects were still subtle, but it was important that he realized this now. Just because he had a lot of time left, didn't mean that his Scarlet Star Force had no ability to affect him now. In fact, if he had let it rampage around for any longer, he would have suffered pretty greatly. If his body hit empty, but he kept trying to push it, the result would be disastrous. There was another mother that was exceptionally important here. Within his formation, the fatigue aspects of the Air Wars world couldn't affect him so long as he kept it activated, and yet he was still so tired. This painted a picture that couldn't be more obvious, that formation truly took a lot out of him. Lionel adjusted himself and his gaze grew firm. With a step he vanished from his pod and appeared on the tall city walls of his territory. Down below, the ocean pounded against the walls. The others should have woken up long before him and started executing his orders. The surrounding 20 kilometers were all within their purview. There were almost too many things to clear in this region. However, not only did Lionel have that 20 kilometers, but he had also spent all 30 billion of his points to extend it by an additional 300 kilometers using his underwater outposts. The best part was that these underwater outposts that he had bought at a cost of 10 million points each, also had the teleportation function. I've rested enough, it seems that it's about time to begin. Lionel flickered and vanished. The supercontinent was conquered. There was only a final push to be made. Once he had finished accumulating, it would be time to march toward the dark side continent. But for now, these gold and air grade challenges and dungeons were his. Chapter 1994. Published at 11th of July 2023 1:07 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1994. Show me if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The current situation wasn't bad, it could even be said to be quite excellent. Due to Kiza's actions, Lionel had gained himself around 200,000 beasts. The beasts didn't have great combat prowess, but they did have great speed, and their strength was at least enough to match up to bronze-grade threats. Those that had crossed the Tier 4 barrier could match up against those of the 7th dimension. Theta M. In reality, these beasts were quite pitiful. The gap between the tiers of the 7th dimension should be enormous. The gap between Tier 9 of the 6th dimension and Tier 1 of the 7th was only a precursor to what one might find on the other side. Someone like Lionel and Aina who could battle across that barrier could only be said to be monsters. As many of their number was already in Tier 6, they should have been the strongest creatures of the air wars, and yet they were already now on their third owner without any ability to resist. This was also the reason why, though Lionel took this gain as a positive, it was only a slight one. He didn't expect these beasts to cause a game-changing event unless he used them with exceptional cleverness, though he wasn't unique to such things. Ironically, Lionel's strongest fighters were probably those of the Cloud race, specifically Mei. If he fought her while holding back, the odds of him winning were next to zero. She was a tier of strength beyond even James. However, he had oddly chosen to sideline her into an odd position. The rest of the Cloud race in general were exceptional. Even the weakest of a gold-grade threat, while most were beyond and could face an air-grade threat on their own. It was almost a shame that Lionel only had control over a few thousand of them. Lionel organized these thoughts as he moved through the water with great speed. Soon, he had reached the region of the first air-grade threat. In truth, Lionel didn't have to go through all of this trouble. He had already thought of the golden-scaled koi fish in his possession. So long as he released that annoying little guy, a storm of force would form quite quickly that would catch the attention of all the oceanic beasts. This was the very same tactic it had used when it caused that oceanic beast flood all those years ago. It would benefit Lionel quite greatly to use it to his advantage now, or so it seemed. But there were many issues with this approach, the first of which being the fact that there wasn't enough control. That insane method only worked when your goal was to destroy everything. Lionel didn't want to do such a thing. The effort for the reward wasn't worth it. It had to be remembered that for the air grade upgrade challenge, there would be 10 million gold grade threats matched with 100 air grade generals. There were already quite a number of air grade threats just in this region alone. If Lionel really used the koi fish, he would end up facing a threat even worse than the air grade upgrade challenge. At that point, he would be digging his own grave. There was, of course, another problem as well, and that was alerting his enemies to what he was doing. The commotion of such a method wouldn't be small in the slightest, so this was his best choice. That said, Lionel wasn't here to gather a measly 100,000 points. Rather, while everyone else was focused on clearing the challenges and the dungeons, he was focused on clearing these air-grade ocean monsters. As for why? The answer to that was obvious. He wanted their soul constructs. At the same time, this location was a convenient time to test the changes in his Void Star Force. Lionel extended a hand and grasped at the water, bringing out his black rod. At the same time, his first-tier divine armor covered his body as 5 stars appeared to his back. Vital star force flooded the peaks and crevices of his armor, lighting up the dark depths of the ocean. In the distance, an enormous shark beast finally noticed Lionel's appearance. Its menacing teeth bared and it swept its tail out just once. This simple action shot it forward like an iron ball from a cannon, the water gliding against its slipper skin as it grew to double its size in Lionel's eyes in an instant. Lionel's pupils constricted. Fast. He hadn't expected the jump to air grade would be so enormous. He had experienced the jumps from subgrade to bronze grade up to gold grade and he had thought he had a solid understanding by now, but just this movement alone let him know that he was very wrong. Bang! Lionel blocked the charge of the shark, feeling his organs jar as he was sent flying backward. His gaze narrowed. It was harder to produce force underwater, but after you had succeeded, the impact of that force was much greater. Flying through the air was one matter, but being sent flying through water, especially at great speed, felt like he was being hit with a freight train again and again. Alright, fair enough. Lionel balanced himself as the shark beast charged again. He took a deep breath. Even underwater, he wasn't impeded at all. At his level, he didn't see objects like he had back in the third dimension, especially not after comprehending a bit of force manipulation. Items weren't just themselves, they were also the sum of the forces that summed them up. Separating out the water force and only absorbing the wind force that carried the oxygen he wanted was all too easy for the current Lionel. Lionel wasn't enraged that this shark beast was powerful at all, in fact he was happy. The more powerful it was, the more worthwhile this would be. He even hoped they would get stronger. Rather than switching to his second-tier armor or activating star fusion, Lionel's body relaxed and he brandished his spear as the shark appeared before him again. This would be the only remaining time he had to do this before he was embroiled in battle after battle again. He wanted to see how much more room he had to improve his void star force. The two dark blue stars to his back glowed, the ocean waters suddenly trembling. Show me what you can do. Chapter 1995. Published at 11th of July 2023 1:07 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1995. Not enough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's battle intent blazed. With a step, a vortex of water formed to the sole of his feet. The water in the surroundings grew much heavier and the blazing light around him dimmed. The charging shark beast immediately found that its forward momentum was stifled greatly. Although it still appeared before Lionel with great speed, this time, Lionel had more than enough time to react. He swung down with a savage intention, his divine armor trembling with life. Bang! The shark beast was sent spiraling downward, but Lionel's gaze narrowed. Its skin was a great combination of silky and slippery matched with tough and rubbery. Getting a good slice on it was difficult, but even when you managed to, its skin and the underlying flesh and fat was so elastic and injury-proof. Lionel took another step and surged down toward the shark beast. He felt the changes in the water around him. As the pressure increased, he seemed to get closer and closer to the feeling that void star force gave him. What Lionel was looking for was an enlightenment similar to what he had gained from Earth Force. His comprehension of it had been entirely flipped on its head when he realized that Earth Force was just as much related to life force as any of the other elements. Bang! 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 Theta M. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he clashed with the shark beast again and again. Although he was still holding back, the strength of this shark beast was still far outside of his expectations. He didn't even have half a dozen people who could face off against these creatures alone. Dealing with 100 would definitely come with great difficulty. It was no wonder the upgrade challenge didn't require facing off against millions of them. If that was the task, there probably wouldn't be anyone who could accomplish such a thing among the heirs. Even if they all decided to work together, it would be fruitless. Lionel punched out once, meeting the jagged edge of one of the shark beast's large teeth. Crack. That's it, that's the feeling right there. Lionel had chosen to change his approach after several exchanges. His water force affinity simply wasn't high enough to try and grasp the secrets of void star force just by relying on the water around him alone. But it was a different question if he tried to map on his feelings towards Scarlet Star Force toward the force that should be its most direct opposite. When he used Scarlet Star Force now, he could feel the presence of a barrier that extended from his body, a domain that sought to destroy everything in his path with a single touch. It repelled and shredded apart all. He looked for a similar feeling within the runes of his void star force and he found it. Rather than repelling and shredding apart, it gathered and fused. Once destroyed on contact, and the other almost seemed to create more of a thing, but it wasn't exactly that. Rather than creating, it was making it more substantial, more tangible, much heavier. Lionel's fist became like a vortex, swallowing everything in its path. The result was a fist that was twice as heavy-handed. Even without adding any more strength to his blow, it became twice as powerful, shattering the tooth of the shark beast and making it cry out in pain. Sound waves traveled with much more vigor and water, the echo almost shattered Lionel's eardrums, but he still followed up again, and then again. With every strike, his fist became heavier and heavier, until he suddenly swung out with his spear. With a single thrust, a spiraling pattern of blood and torn flesh ripped through the shark beast's tough skin. Lionel dodged out of the way of a tail swipe, fighting against the startling current that formed to pierce out again and again. Every time he did so, his comprehension seemed to deepen and the violent black hole of his power became more and more profound. Void Star Force should have had the greatest defensive power, but its offensive power was truly startling. Suddenly, Lionel raised a hand and clenched his fist. The shark beast that had chosen to suddenly turn in an attempt to run found the waters around it as viscous as cold lard. It swayed its tail with as much strength as it could muster, but even that action seemed to have slowed considerably. Lionel appeared above its head, the intent in his eyes blazing as a deep blue vortex danced within the depths of his irises. It looked as though his gaze alone could swallow up the world as he pierced downward. The blade of his spear extended and a rotating vortex of black-blue took shape. The head of the shark beast caused Lionel's attack to pause for just 2 seconds before he finally ripped through, shredding into its bone and eventually its brain. The shark beast unleashed one final howl before it collapsed, unable to sustain its life any longer. Lionel's point total raised by 100,000 points as he waved a hand, storing the corpse of the shark beast. He took a breath and exhaled. He didn't feel too good about that battle. Void Star Force was a force on par with Scarlet Star Force, but it didn't feel that way in his hands. Even with such effort, it still took 2 seconds to break through the shark beast's head. That amount of time was an eternity at his level. If there were any other variables, he would have failed. I need to keep honing it. The ocean holds too much importance for me to not be able to bring out incredible strength within its limits. This isn't enough. This was the secondary benefit of him sending everyone out now. They had no choice but to gain experience fighting in the depths of the ocean. It was the only way for him to make sure that they would be ready for anything. Lionel shot forward, aiming for his second air-grade beast. Chapter 1996. Published at 11th of July 2023 1:07 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1996. 3rd and 4th. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As Lionel's actions seemed to garner a ton of attention due to the appearance of yet another rare force, the situation on the night side continent was suffering its own sort of trial by fire. While Lionel had succeeded in unifying his continent, this was far from the case for the night side. This was only to be expected. Not only were there large movements from 1st Nova, 3rd Nova, 4th Nova and 6th Nova, this continent also had the Omen family, the Spirituals faith and half of the Constellation families. While Lionel's continent was whole, the night side continent was divided into at least a dozen large-scale territories that covered hundreds of kilometers in radius. The fight over resources was great and many had begun to realize that having access to the ocean's waters was of huge importance. Even so, if there was one that had eked out a first-place position in the hearts of those watching, it actually seemed to be 3rd Nova, Zavnik. In the beginning, Zavnik had used a huge loophole to his advantage. Each family had only been allowed to send in a maximum of 2 heirs, but there was no such limitation across families or alliances. This had helped the Constellation Bao alliance form a huge coalition quite quickly before they were destroyed by Lionel, and it had likewise helped Zavnik. Rather than having his people enter as his kill exchanges, he made a bet on himself and had them enter alone. Many realized that Zavnik may very well have had even more subordinates than it seemed. It was just that many of them had ended up on Lionel's continent instead of his own. But regardless, he had caused so many heirs to defect to his side that he had started off with a hot streak that he had yet to allow anyone to close. Despite the volatility of the night side continent, Zavnik alone had taken out 2 constellation families, the Cornus and Cancer families. From the Cancer family, he gained a large waterfront territory, securing a large coastal control as had become the meta of the night side continent. Much like the Pisc and Aquarius families, the Cancer family had come with the intention of targeting the ocean. However, the Cancer family was a bit of an anomaly. For lack of a better descriptor, the Cancer family were parasites. The type of water force they controlled was one they called Cancer Force. This force was a fusion of life force, water force and soul force, and it had applications as odd as this fusion of forces. The Cancer family was able to use water force as a carrier of their force. Once their Cancer force was deployed, so long as the target had any water force in them, they would be cursed. This was a fate that humans couldn't dodge, as far too much of their bodies were formed of this force. Depending on the path the Cancer family had taken, they could do quite a number of things with this control. Some controlled humans, others controlled beasts, some were excellent at reconnaissance, but all were quite well known as Cancers. The original plan of the Cancer family was to poison the ocean's waters with their Cancer force and forcefully take hold of the creatures within its limits. The trouble with this plan is that it would take quite a long time. It was relatively easier since corrupting water force was what they did first, but the ocean was, obviously, impressively large. The other problem with this plan is that it was quite useless to control oceanic beasts if they couldn't change the situation on land. The Cancer family hadn't been able to find an underwater territory in time, so they had to settle for one on land for the time being, but that made them a target for Zavnik to crush. In addition to this, Zavnik took control of the oceanic beasts that the Cancer family had managed to gather for himself, using them as the spearheads for his scouting. The Cornus family was the only high-level family of the human domain known purely for their hand-to-hand combat. However, they were also the fourth and final family with strong ties to water force. In fact, the style of their close combat was entirely built on concepts of the tides and waves. One might realize at this point that this was most definitely not a coincidence. For two of the families Zavnik had targeted to have such ties, it was clear that this was likely his plan from the beginning. He knew that he didn't have affinity with water force and as such relied on others who did to build the foundation he would need to take advantage of it. While he gained oceanic beasts from the Cancer family, what he gained from the Cornus family was arguably even more valuable. They had a treasure designed to read and record the waves, almost like radar but with water force instead. They used their comprehension of tides and waves to form this sort of scouting device. Like this, Zavnik had gained not just one, but two methods of exploring the ocean's waters. He knew well that First Nova's partner was the princess of the Aquarius family. If he wanted to make sure he didn't lose his advantage, he had to push quite fiercely. Though he thought this didn't stop him from marching on the night side continent. As for his target, it was none other than Fourth Nova, Seo. Fourth Nova was none other than the very same Nova who had tried to sign Aina to a contract. He seemed to have changed greatly since then, having vanished into thin air. Since then, Lionel hadn't seen or heard a peep out of him. But now it seemed that there would be a clash between two brothers once again. Zavnik looked forward with a confident expression while Seo looked down from the city walls quite solemnly. Zavnik's army had already grown to almost 1 million. It was likely that after this campaign, he would directly challenge the gold grade upgrade trial. After a moment, though, Fourth Nova's expression sharpened, the hum of a spear echoing from him. Chapter 1997. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:54 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1997. Long time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As Third and Fourth Nova faced off against one another, First Nova had made great progress as well. As expected, he made great use of having Vega by his side. The Aquarius family had high affinity in both the wind and water. Their understanding and comprehension of both is exceptionally profound, and thanks to this, their seafaring vessels are without a doubt the best in the whole of the human domain. Adaworth's trust in Vega was no less than Lionel's trust in Aina. As such, after reaching a certain point, the two separated themselves between two territories, one underwater and the other on land. Their efficiency was quite great and their progress was excellent. These two, First and Third Nova, were without a doubt the two with the strongest presence in the water on the night-side supercontinent. The others could only be said to be much further behind, but this didn't mean that they didn't have their own advantages. Sixth Nova had focused entirely on his military might. Much like Lionel, he claimed a territory as quickly as possible, carving out a place for himself. Although his territory wasn't the largest as that right was left to Zavnik, it was the second largest. However, he had run into problems of his own as well, much like Fourth Nova. He found himself sandwiched between both the Omen and spiritual faith. Much like Vega and Adaworth had separated, his partner, Bruno, had no choice but to take the helm in sweeping toward the west while he moved toward the east. After several clashes, the Omen and spiritual faith seemed to realize that Sixth Nova wouldn't be easily dealt with, and as such they turned their attention away. Even so, most seemed to believe that Valor's days were numbered. The spiritual faith didn't seem to be taking part in these air wars for the sake of victory. Rather, they had only sent in a few dozen individuals, all of whom had spiritual blood running through their veins. Their only goal seemed to be to display their strength and spread awe for the spiritual race. The Omen family didn't have great combat strength just yet, as many of those they had exchanged for were pure crafters. However, with such a large team of crafters working as one, there was no doubt that the longer the Omen family was allowed to survive, the larger their future advantage would be. Due to these reasons, many waved off Sixth Nova's ability to survive. While the spiritual faith had decided to focus elsewhere, it was only a matter of time before they felt it was about time to take him down. At the same time, once the Omen family settled and began rolling out their crafts with great momentum, who would be able to stop him? Valor's only chance seemed to be to deal with them as quickly as possible, but it was clear to all that he didn't have the ability to do this. The Omen family was led by a young man. He was exceptionally tall, almost 7 feet, in fact, but his frame was quite slight, the shoulders of his lab coat seeming to be quite loose on him. This young man was Crone. Had Lionel bothered to enter the Force Crafting Guild of the Void Palace, he would have recognized this young man. Because Ramon was so low-key, it was widely accepted that the best crafter of the younger generation was none other than Crone Omen, the younger cousin of Cynthia Omen, the scorned Queen Beauty. That said, even if Ramon was less of an introvert, the winner between the two of them wouldn't be clear. As talented as Ramon was, he split quite a bit of his time for his spear domain lineage factor, and even beyond that, most of his crafting research was focused on forging his divine armor. This focus had allowed him to form an exceptionally powerful gauntlet of divine armors, but these were obviously niche crafts that only he alone could use. Crone, however, was much more of a pure crafter. His skill was more wide-ranging and his tool kit was much deeper. That said, Crone wasn't alone in this. The brain power of the entire Omen family was at his back. The Omen family had entered with a systematic plan. Even their battle with Sixth Nova was nothing more than a pretext for keeping up appearances. There was a perfect blueprint they would follow from start to finish, a blueprint that had been worked on by the scorned Queen Beauty herself. This was the expertise of not a gold-grade crafter, but a tried-and-true life-grade crafter, and not just a normal life grade, but the true life grade of the 8th dimension. All of the plans, from start to finish, had been drawn up by her. Crone could be considered to be of a middle generation as well, too old to be among the Cataclysm generation, and too young to be a part of the Nebula generation of the Morales. Outside of crafting circles, his name was still capable of resonating, but it wasn't to the same extent of Cynthia and Velasco of the past. However, what he could do was execute orders, and thanks to his ability index, he was the perfect choice for this job. Crone stood in silence, monitoring the progress of the army of crafters. Very soon, everything would be ready. At this pace, they only needed 3 more days. After that, there wouldn't be anyone that could stop them. Lionel took deep breaths and exhaled, the momentum of both causing the waters around him to tremble. After a moment, he pulled up a giant squid beast's corpse and stowed it away. He had been hunting air-grade threats all day and he had managed to capture just above 30. This was already a good number and he felt that he was running on fumes now, so it was about time he returned. He found the nearest underwater outpost and flashed back to his city's core. But the moment he appeared, his pupils constricted. There was someone here. Lionel's head whipped around but he couldn't spot them with his eyes immediately. Ignoring his fatigue, he deployed his starry spirit domain, enveloping the region with his dream world. When he saw who the two were, he immediately understood. Those cracked city cores, they weren't from failed upgrades at all, were they? They were you too. Out from the shadows, two figures appeared. One was very obviously Second Nova. It turned out that Lionel was right to believe that 5 Novas wouldn't be placed on a single continent. There was indeed a third here. The second figure should be his partner, wrapped in mystery. However, the fogginess couldn't block Lionel's dream world. Long time no see, Kira. Chapter 1998. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:54 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1998. Kira Salvatine. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Kira was someone that Lionel had met long ago. She was actually the reason Little Blackstar had such great strength now. She was a bit quirky and silly, and Lionel found her to be actually quite adorable, but these could be considered to be less than ideal circumstances to meet, though Lionel had already guessed that something like this would happen. Back when the two of them had met in the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone, she had already told him that she couldn't become one of his generals because she was already tied to one of his cousins. Obviously, that cousin turned out to be Second Nova. Lionel had been wondering about this for quite a while, though. The Salvatine family that Kira came from should have exceptional power. After all, how could a normal family possibly gain the blood of a void beast? It had to be remembered that void beasts were the most powerful and devastating creatures of the universe. The spirituals were commonly known as the most powerful race, but that was only because void beasts were so few in number. It was hard to rank them among such powerhouses because many believed that they had long since been extinct. For the Salvatine family to not only have such a large vial of their blood, but to even treat that blood like a gift to give a little girl who was only in the 5th dimension at the time, just how great did their power need to be? But oddly enough, Lionel simply never heard a peep about the Salvatine family after entering the wider world of the human domain. He didn't hear of any of them in the Void Palace, they weren't on any leaderboards, they didn't even appear for the gathering of powers that decided the rules of these air wars either. They seemed to have never existed at all, almost as though Kira had simply made up her name and that her family never existed to begin with. This much was still acceptable. After all, the human domain was large and the Lionel of back then was quite weak. Who knew, maybe the Salvatine family wasn't nearly as strong as he had thought them to be and had just happened to run into the treasure of a void beast's corpse. In that case, Kira would likely have just been insane to casually give something like that out, but she was a bit of an airhead to begin with, so that was relatively easy for Lionel to accept. However, the problem with that line of thinking was that Lionel had been to the Void Library. Not only had he been to that library, he had read everything within it. And yet, that library didn't have a single mention of the Salvatine family, not a small historical footnote, no family register, not a single mention or peep about them. Lionel didn't understand why this was before, but he suddenly understood now. When he looked at the shadowy figure that was Kira, it felt all so obvious. Kira wasn't human at all, she wasn't a beast, nor was she a spiritual. She was actually a demon. The shadows seemed to tremble slightly and then pout when Lionel called her out, but she still didn't step out, nor did Lionel expect her to. She had already made her allegiances clear and Lionel didn't blame her for it. What was she supposed to do? Betray Oren despite the fact she had known him for her entire life while she had only met him for a brief instance? That didn't even make sense. Kira's shadowy figure trembled once more and a pair of short sabers emitting dense black fog took form in her palms. At the same time, Oren moved slightly and a similar pair of short sabers appeared in his own. He didn't respond to Lionel's words, and if he was surprised by the fact that Lionel knew Kira, he didn't show it. However, his silence was more than proof enough to the likes of Lionel. Many had taken all sorts of differing approaches to the air wars, some targeted the ocean, some prepared beasts ahead of time, others plotted and schemed as they built up large factories of crafting treasures. But there was one very important thing that all of these people missed. What good was all this preparation if your heir died? The moment an heir died, it was all over. The run of that power and the territory behind it would be finished. It was that plain and simple. During his tirade through the Dayside supercontinent, Lionel had run across many abandoned territories with cracked city cores. In fact, he had benefited from quite a few of them himself. He had originally thought that these territories had simply failed their upgrades, as it was the most logical conclusion at the time, but seeing this now, it changed everything. Clearly, Oren had a method of sneaking into a territory undetected. If Lionel was correct, he was probably testing out this method on weaker powers before he targeted the ones he really wanted to get rid of, but he had likely never expected for Lionel to clear the supercontinent and claim it for himself so quickly. Even so, Oren had now perfected his method, and as far as he was concerned, Lionel had only made his job easier. Now he would be able to head to the other continent and claim victory in these air wars long before anyone could mount resistance. Now, his target was to deal with Lionel. Seeing the two prepared for battle, Lionel took a deep breath. He had already sent everyone out on missions, and though they returned to rest whenever they were fatigued, it wouldn't be all together. Plus, how useful would they be if they returned as fatigued as he currently was? Wind surged toward Lionel from all sides, his lungs expanding as his heart pumping. Suddenly, the two figures of Oren and Kira vanished. Chapter 1999. Published at 19th of July 2023, 8:54 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1999, That Force. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression became one of unprecedented seriousness. He couldn't seem to track the two without deploying his starry spirit domain, even his bow domain eyes didn't work. But in this state, deploying his starry spirit domain was quite the difficult task. At the same time, he knew how powerful Kira was. Even back then, suppressed by the dimensional cleanse world, she had given him an exceptionally tough battle, and that was without having access to her ability index or lineage factor on top of that. Oren's strength needed even less introduction. He was an heir of the Morales family, and unlike Ramon, he seemed to be proficient in a weapon other than the spear, making his spear domain lineage factor quite useless in the grand scheme outside of course, the power it could give him. This wasn't the only troublesome matter either. There was a very obvious and important question that he was ignoring in all of this. How was it that Oren was related to a demon family? There were only really two explanations, one of which was decidedly worse than the other, and that was of course that Oren had demon blood running through his body. This wasn't just a small, hand-waved issue. Lionel had already learned from the current patriarch of the Morales family that many of their ancestors and the other talented among them had trouble controlling their tempers, and that was related to the demonic characteristics of the metal synergy lineage factor. Logically speaking, this was a flaw, and any sort of flaw in a lineage factor made it weaker than it should have been. If Oren was half demon, it was likely that this flaw in his body was almost negligible, making the amount of strength that he could pull from his lineage factor far more than what one would see from most other Morales family members. Of course, no matter what advantage he had in this regard, it was impossible for him to match up to Lionel, who had brought the metal synergy lineage factor the 8th dimension far ahead of time. But it still had to be considered that Lionel was still in the 6th dimension while Oren was already in the 7th. As the second eldest Morales, the second Nova, Oren was already in Tier 3 of the 7th dimension. Until now, Lionel hadn't cared much about tiers because his talent so heavily suppressed everyone else. But if he was correct about Oren, then the advantage he had was far smaller, and that didn't even begin to mention Kira, who was likely a full demon at Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. Lionel had met the geniuses of other races in the tribulation zone of his spear domain ring. Although he had defeated them, he didn't underestimate them for even a second. Pain shot through his body and he felt as though an entire side of him had gone limp. The corrosion was devastating and more potent than any poison. Lionel's gaze flashed and his scarlet star force circulated through his body, incinerating the death force to ash. His mouth opened and he unleashed a roar, his absolute spear domain roaring to life and shredding everything in his immediate surroundings to pieces. Chapter 2000. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:54 and 11 seconds AM Chapter 2000, Fair? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and his gaze became frighteningly cold. At that moment it was as though he had become a completely different person. His steps became calculated and measured, his spear strikes no longer feeling as wild and passionate. A cold breeze passed by as he stomped on the ground hard, his city lord manner trembling. His starry spirit domain vanished as he dismissed it. In its place, his starry star domain and starry light domain manifested at once. He took another step back. A saber came to a stop just before his forehead before it retracted. He took a step to the side. A saber whizzed by his ear just as he brandished his own blade. Clang! A shadowy figure took a step back and solidified for a moment before vanishing once more. However, Lionel still struck forward anyway, meeting resistance instantly. Clang! Lionel weaved in and out of the two of them. He never moved more than he had to, his energy reserves being perfectly preserved. In fact, it even felt that he was somewhat recovering. As time passed, Lionel entered less and less of a passive state. His spear force flourished, his universal force uplifting his body as he struck with stronger and stronger momentum. The abyss of his eyes could only be described as frigid. He didn't see people, he saw objects. He didn't see spear strikes, he saw angles. He didn't see defeat, he only saw a path to victory, as though a practiced chess master, his every step forward seemed to drive his enemies further and further into a corner. 93%. Lionel's right foot swept back in a semicircular arc, gliding along the floor as his hips swerved. A saber whistled by his neck. The distance was too close to use his spear, but that didn't stop him from using his fist. His spear vanished in a blink and his hips snapped back like an elastic band, his punching rocketing forward with it. Lionel finally connected with something solid, his second-tier armor billowing with violet steam as his star fusion, King's Might, roared. Bang! A shadowy figure was sent flying, piercing through the air. However, just before they crashed into the walls of the city manor, they vanished. Lionel was unmoved by the change. He had already moved again, his void star force rippling as he swung his spear out in a wide arm. Everywhere it passed, strong ripples passed through the air, almost like watching a bullet compress the wind in slow motion. Yet another figure was sent flying, a mouthful of blood flying through the air. Lionel was certain that this one was Kira, and the first had been Oren. They were actually so difficult to tell apart for him even now. Even so, Kira too vanished before crashing into anything. Lionel exhaled a breath, his frigid gaze becoming even colder. A piercing headache was threatening to split his mind in two currently, but he couldn't seem to feel it at all, having activated dream sense. He held his spear out, his heels slowly pivoting. Kira and Oren didn't appear for a long while. He narrowed his eyes, breathing slowly. But even after several minutes had passed by, they didn't appear again. They've left? Lionel made a show of relaxing slightly, but his heart was secretly on guard. For a pair of assassins like them, he wouldn't casually lower his guard. Although he had gained the upper hand while relying on his ability index, his mind felt like it was going to explode. Simulating the two of them and their actions felt like the most difficult thing he had ever done, and he was certain they hadn't even been going all out. Did they only come to probe me? But this would be their best opportunity to get rid of me, why would they only come to probe me? Lionel's gaze narrowed. Something was odd here. Of course, Kira's identity was a bit surprising to him. It had to be remembered that the Silver Empire had been destroyed because of their relation to demons. The fact that Oren had demon blood running through his veins as a Morales was shocking in and of itself, but to also have contact with the demon race as well? That was definitely a step beyond anything Lionel could have expected. Lionel hadn't said anything about Kira's identity out loud because of this very reason. In addition, maybe only he could see through such a thing at a glance. He had not only seen demons personally, he had the sensory capabilities to see the true nature of a person's soul. Unless one had a higher dream force affinity than himself, or an extraordinary treasure, it was simply impossible for them to hide their true nature from him. But what was their purpose, exactly? Theta M, Big Bro Oren, is that all? Kira appeared. By this time, they were already far outside the limits of Lionel's territory, having already crossed a large distance through the ocean. Kira was a bit indignant. It seemed she had wanted to fight some more. This was the second time she had lost to Lionel like that. Oren showed a rare smile and laughed, rubbing Kira's head like she was still a little girl. He's worthy of being our Morales family's heir. It was just a little test. You didn't even let me use 10% of my strength, though. That's not fair. Oren laughed harder. You're in the 7th dimension, even if you won, would it be fair? Kira crossed her arms over her chest and pouted. You know my situation, I can't become the heir of the Morales, it'll only cause them catastrophe. But before I exit stage left, I'll have to deal with another catastrophe first. Oren's gaze turned cold, facing in the direction of Third Nova's territory. He only had one goal here, and that was to deal with that third cousin of his. At that moment, on the night side continent, Third Nova stood over the territory of Fourth Nova. Co had suffered a crushing defeat. Chapter 2003. Published at 19th of July 2023 8:54 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2003, devastating if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The third most likely was 6th Nova, and that was only because Lionel knew the least about him, while the fourth was 1st Nova. 6th Nova was an unknown variable while 1st Nova was the son of the current patriarch. The latter faced almost too much scrutiny on the daily basis to avoid detection of the masses. But the real question was, what would Lionel do about this? Given the strength of Kira and Oren, he didn't think anyone of the Umbra family could follow them covertly. The best he could do was monitor the general situation of the night-side supercontinent. But what if he failed? Lionel's brow furrowed. Just as he was thinking, several flashes entered the city lord's mansion. He didn't even need to look to know that it was the Umbra family. They were actually a day late, but he didn't berate them. If there wasn't a good reason, they wouldn't be. Lionel had originally expected them back yesterday, but the fact they had only come today wasn't bad news, it was actually good news. It meant there was information to be had. As expected, after Radleys began his report, Lionel's gaze narrowed. When he got to the end, Lionel's entire perspective shifted. Fourth Nova fell? Lionel's heart skipped a beat. This could only mean that his deduction was wrong. If the number one threat to Oren could fall to Third Nova's hands so easily, then Oren would have never had to put in so much effort in the first place. Lionel had a hard time believing that someone as powerful as Oren, and more importantly intelligent, would put so much effort into something that was such a non-factor. The only explanation was that Fourth Heaven wasn't the true threat, the true threat was Third Nova. Third Nova's forces were too overwhelming. He had exaggerated numbers under his wing and they were all of exceptional strength. Fourth Nova didn't even last very long before he was directly kicked out. After that, his actions caused a cascade of events. Sixth Nova fell not long afterward, and it's somewhat unknown how this happened. Originally, Sixth Nova was stuck between the spiritual faith and the Omen Empire, but neither seemed to have been the ones to take him out. He just suddenly vanished and his territory crumbled not long after. Lionel frowned. Could it be that Second Nova had gone after Sixth Nova? Was he wrong about his intentions all along? Then again, it might also be a method of protecting Sixth Nova. Aside from him, Sixth Nova was the youngest, and he was most definitely the weakest among them all after the strength Lionel had seen Fifth Nova display. This wasn't the fault of Sixth Nova, he was just disadvantaged. He had only just entered the 7th dimension and most of his subordinates weren't up to par. He faced similar issues to Lionel. More than just himself had been screwed over by the delay in the air wars. But would Third Nova really dare to kill? At the end of the day, patriarch of the Morales family was just a temporary position, and one could almost be considered a figurehead. The ones who held the real power in the family were still the ancestors. Just by becoming the patriarch, Third Nova couldn't just hand over the reins of the family to the Seward family. Even if there were family rules protecting Third Nova, given the fiery tempers of the Morales ancestor, would he even last a day past a single reckless decision? That was when Lionel's expression suddenly changed. I think you should take a look at that was right. The checks and balances of the Morales family were so impossibly sturdy. There was an underlying threat here that he wasn't seeing, an underlying threat that made Second Nova entirely unwilling to see Third Nova even have the chance. Lionel's gaze suddenly became frighteningly cold. Third Nova had made an enemy he wasn't even expecting to have made. Not only would Lionel defeat him, he wouldn't hesitate to kill him. Worst came to worst, if Lionel interrogated his soul and found that he was wrong, he would simply revive him. But from what it seemed like now, although he didn't have the evidence, Third Nova was tied to something exceptionally sinister. Oren could have never guessed that just a single probing attack of Lionel, an encounter that lasted no more than a few minutes, would actually give the latter this much information. As for whether this was a good thing or not, only time would tell. After Sixth Nova fell, there was a huge shift in the land. He had controlled a great deal of territory, and with his disappearance after his badge was crushed, all of his subordinates vanished as well. The other territories attempted to swallow it up, leading to a whole host of battles, of which it seemed that First Nova came on top. Third Nova had been occupied by his battle with Fourth Nova and didn't receive the information until much later. By the time he marched over, the land had already been divided. The only powers worthy of note left on the night side continent are First Nova, Third Nova, the Spiritual Faith, the Omen, the Seward family, the Ram family and the Pious family. Lionel's gaze flickered. Could it be that Second Nova had taken out Sixth Nova to cause this abrupt change? His timing was even so perfect, with Third Nova occupied by Fourth Nova. The one who gained the most advantage was First Nova and Third Nova was late to react. What is the Seward family up to? Why does it feel like you have so little information about them? Lionel couldn't help but realize this. Also, he hadn't quite abandoned the idea that Third Nova was tied to them. With one being so active and the other being so silent, it felt suspicious. He raised his head to the skies, unleashing a roar. I think you should take a look at the waves of the ocean near his city rose like a tsunami. However, just when it seemed that it would swallow his city whole, it seemed to have crashed into an invisible dome. It was sent flying back with even greater speed, splitting the ocean tides into two to the point the barren bottom of the ocean could be seen for dozens of miles. Lionel's palm flipped over as a spear appeared in his hand. The blade rod expanded and a menacing blade formed. With a step through the air, Lionel appeared high in the skies, thrusting out his spear. His blade tip vanished and he seemed to have pierced out dozens of times in a single instant. Lionel's stance shifted and his spear swung. A beautiful spear dance overwhelmed the skies. Every time Lionel moved, the clouds above would split. After several moments, a gorgeous pattern appeared within him. The wind moved with his breath, space bent to his movements, time paused with his sight. A complex force art continuously grew beneath his feet. It seemed to respond to his spear dance, forming gentle strokes with his soft movement and thick gauges with his powerful eruptions. Lionel felt like a god upholding the skies. There didn't seem to be a division between the air he thrust through, the skies above and the earth below. Every time he attacked, it was as though his blade covered everything in the plain. And soon the beautiful pattern appearing in the clouds above also began to form on the ground below. The Morales watching this spear dance felt their spears hum. Those with the spear domain lineage factor couldn't even control themselves as their spear crowns appeared above their heads, their irises flickering with raging spear force that wanted to howl into the skies above. Their hearts moved with Lionel's every swing, their breaths caught in their throats. It had all clicked for Lionel at once. It was all connected. Indeed, the life grade had always been the guiding lamp. The moment he had thought that his force arts would be the secret to the next evolution of his spear, he had been correct. He just hadn't known what the foundation would be, but now he knew. Lionel's gaze sharpened as his spear pierced into the skies. His entire being moved as one, the clouds above and the ground below glowed, the force art beneath his feet suddenly expanding to the point that it dwarfed the city below it. The spear howl seemed to be heard throughout the human domain, it tore through the canopy, forming the maw of a dragon as it soared, striking through the starry skies above. It was the kind of strike that would be indelibly marked in the memories of all those who saw it. It was a statement bolder than arrogance, louder than words, timeless and ageless. It was the strike of a new path of the spear. This wasn't very long normally, but a lot could happen in a battle, the most obvious of which would be his ritual being interrupted. And obviously, a person who he needed to use such a strike against would be more than capable of interrupting him. The second problem was that this was the fourth layered state for a mere, sixth-dimensional spear force. If he improved to a seventh-dimensional spear force now, he would only be able to touch the third layered state with this spear dance. And Lionel had no intention of holding back his spear force just for this. There was good news, though. I think you should take a look at when he began his spear dance. Each and every one of his spear strikes was at the limit of the third layer, individually more powerful than almost any other technique he had. This meant that while he was accumulating, it wasn't as though he couldn't threaten his opponent. In fact, he would be likely to shred an enemy to pieces before he could even unleash the final attack. But then there was more bad news. Lionel wasn't quite sure how to translate this to his bow. With his spear, he could use his spear dance, but with his bow he could only stand in place and draw his bowstring. He would be a sitting duck. When would he have the time to stand around for 5 minutes in battle without attacking? For the first time, his spear had actually surpassed his archery, at least in this regard. Luckily, there was more good news. There were two paths before him to improve now. The first was simplifying the force art, the second was strengthening it. Decreasing the number of lines for the former, and potentially adding layers of complexity for the latter. In addition, this was just one spear dance. Lionel felt that he could create more with differing aspects. This one was particularly overbearing. It was like a beast rampaging within its cage and pulling against its chains, roaring when it finally made its way out. If he could create several spear dances, each with their own unique flair, he could one day enter a state of battle where he never had to step out of his spear dances at all. He could glide from one spear dance to the next, seamlessly using them. If he reached such a state, it would be almost impossible to interrupt a spear dance because he could just flow into another. If it was himself flowing from one to the next, he wouldn't lose any progress. That way, he could incrementally complete one spear dance at a time until he had gathered so much momentum that he could bulldoze his opponents. In fact, maybe one day he would even be able to fuse the final strikes of his spear dances into one, creating an ultimate attack that was simply unblockable. Lionel's spear trembled once and he took a breath, exhaling. He looked down at the heavy black rod in his hands. In the past, just trying to catch it had crushed his fingers, but now he could hear it roar. Just now, Lionel had finally sensed the domain of the black rod and he couldn't help but grin.